Good evening, everybody. I, Council President Walsh, call the May 13th, 2025 Committee of the Whole meeting to order at 6:35 p.m. As a reminder, we continue to have a remote aspect to our meetings, and both staff and members of the public may be participating in tonight's meeting remotely via WebEx. There are multiple public comment opportunities at tonight's meeting. There's a general public comment opportunity at the beginning of the meeting, or you can make comments after the presentation and council question and answer period on any of tonight's agenda items. And so we will start with public comment. Members of the public may address council at this time in person or virtually. Those who signed up in advance to make comments will be called on first. Before I go into the rest, I guess we do have a member of public here, so I'll go through. If you're joining us virtually and would like to make comments, please raise your virtual hand. If you're on the phone, you're going to press *3. If you're on a computer or smartphone, look for the hand icon or send the host a chat message. If you're in the room and did not sign up, I will ask for other speakers before closing that portion of the meeting. And so, seeing if anybody would like to make public comments at tonight's meeting. And do we have anybody online?
No.
Okay, and nobody in the audience wants to make public comments at this time. Okay, fantastic. As a reminder, written comments can always be submitted by emailing citycouncil@issaquah.gov. Okay, so we have a special start to our meeting this evening, and then we have a recognition, and then we've got the 2025 Community Survey, an informational update on the 2024 Citywide performance measures, and then a jail operations financial analysis. But we will start with COM 0145, recognition of Sergeant Fairbanks, if you'll join me at the lectern. Okay, it is not often that we get to recognize someone with such a long period of service. That is not meant as a bad thing. That is absolutely a phenomenal experience for us as a city. And so, Chief Schwan, do you have a few words you want to say about Sergeant Fairbanks?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to speak. I appreciate the opportunity to appear virtually tonight. Sergeant Fairbanks, just to give you an overview, was hired on May 11th of 1998. He went into detectives in September of 12. In December of 13, he was promoted to sergeant. September 16th of 2020, he was acting commander. August 23rd of 23, he was an administrative and traffic sergeant. His training, he has over 1,800 hours of training. There are probably a lot more hours, but our system doesn't go back that far. And so he's had many different positions. He's been a firearms instructor, crisis intervention trainer, an EVOC, which is evasive driving techniques for our officers, a drone operator, motorcycle operator, and a mentor to so many in our department. He's an instructor in active shooter, firearms, building search, radar, taser, less lethal shotgun, to name a few. He's been the IPD range master for 25 years of his 27 years of service. He's a member of the firearms cadre. The school-going cameras were his project from conception to implementation. He wrote a grant for school zone flashing lights on Newport. He served in traffic on a motorcycle for 7 years. He was an SOT, which is our special operations team leader, and peer support team that he's currently still on. He will retire on June 3rd of 2025 after 27 years of law enforcement service. All have been with Issaquah Police Department in the service to the community of Issaquah. All the leadership and experience that we'll be losing with this retirement is a blessing for him, but it will be a huge loss for our department and our city. And we thank you for all your service.
Sergeant Fairbanks. Oh. Would you like to say a few words?
Oh, I never miss the opportunity to talk.
Do it. Go for it.
Like the chief said, I've been here for 27 years. The city has changed drastically in that time. When I got here, the Highlands basically ended at 15th and Park and was a gravel road the rest of the way up the hill, which made it very challenging chasing people on our motorcycles. But it's been a great city to work for. Through all those hours that the chief talked about training, I've trained with local agencies, other agencies throughout the state, some Canadian agencies, some federal agencies, and even some military groups. And I've got to tell you, the people in the building next door, the dispatchers, the records, the corrections, the police are top-notch. I know that it's your job to look at them and make sure everything's going right, but when I hear from other agencies and what they're going through and dealing with it, you guys have it pretty easy. You got a great group over there. I know that the people that are taking my positions are going to take the job further than I ever imagined, and that they're going to be in very great hands going forward. Thank you.
Oh, always wonderful to see somebody who has served the city so long, and hard to let them go in that experience, but appreciate the ability to recognize. So, like I said, we have 3 pretty meaty items on our docket tonight. So we will start out with COM 0095, the 2025 Community Survey presented by Dale Markey Crimp, the Assistant to the City Administrator. And you're bringing with you Derek Harvey from the ETC Institute. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Council President Walsh. Good evening, City Council members. I am thrilled to have the evening with you. Dale Markey Crimp, Assistant to the City Administrator, and the first item I'll be introducing will be the 2025 Community Survey. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to provide the City Council with an overview of the results of the 2025 Biennial Community Survey. There is no immediate direction needed this evening, but there will be plentiful chance to ask questions throughout this presentation. By way of a bit of background, since 2015, the city has conducted a community survey every other year to assess resident perspectives on local government services, policies, and quality of life. This commitment to gathering, analyzing, and incorporating data into decision-making is a key element of the city's strategic process. You can see in our beautiful green wheel here, performance evaluation and community survey. Since 2021, or for the last 3 surveys, the city has contracted with the ETC Institute based out of Olathe, Kansas, to conduct our survey. ETC has conducted this survey biannually between February and late March, early April in each of those years, ensuring that we're gathering feedback in a consistent window. The city made the decision in 2021 to move to ETC as our vendor for a number of reasons, including more flexibility in our survey structure and the ability to add questions that was not previously available with our previous vendor. And in 2021, as you might expect or remember, we were especially interested to understand the impacts and the experience of our residents and community members during and emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to the many services listed here on the slide, ETC has also been able to supply 2 other important tools with their service, tools that you'll get a preview of this evening. Their Importance Satisfaction Matrix, a matrix that identifies where the community's level of satisfaction intersects with its perceived importance for each service. So for example, is there something the community is particularly dissatisfied with that they find to be very important? Is there something that they're incredibly satisfied with that they find to be very important? And the city would pursue different strategies as a result of that intersection of importance and satisfaction. And additionally, an interactive Power BI dashboard. This allows for all interested parties, staff, city leadership, the public to take a deeper dive into the data available. And specifically, and as a data nerd myself, I think especially helpful to be able to look at and understand responses by the different demographic characteristics within our community. To provide an idea of what this process looks like during a survey year, we first start out in the December or January time, reviewing previous survey questions and making revisions and adjustments prior to finalizing the survey in February. ETC then tests the survey amongst their team to make sure that our estimates of the time it takes to take the survey are as accurate as they can be, and that all questions are easily understandable, even to folks unfamiliar with Issaquah. The survey is then distributed in March and April, and results are analyzed, and reports and tools are generated. We find ourselves together here in May, where the results are presented. The administration has already begun to take a look at these results and determine how they can be used and inform modifications and adjustments to current projects and projects that are coming up in short order. And in July, the City Council will further consider this information as part of policymaking and budget conversations at your retreat. Before I turn it over to Derek, our project manager from ETC, to present on the results, I want to share a couple, what I would say are notable decisions and then one notable observation from the survey this year. First and foremost, we worked very hard to shorten or streamline the survey for 2025. We've gotten feedback multiple years in a row that while it was great that we were able to ask additional questions, goodness gracious, this is a long survey. So we both worked to cut and combine some questions where we felt like we had asked the same thing multiple times. And we also noted a longer predicted survey time in the introductory language to this survey. So being a little more realistic that it will not take you 15 minutes, but will likely take you closer to 30 or even more. We also made some changes to some questions. So I noted this just a moment ago, but we wanted to make sure that the questions of the survey aligned to the updated priorities and objectives within the strategic plan, and also that it aligned to our 2025 priorities. So a chance to get some baseline data on the performance specifically around a topic that I came to you last week to talk about, which is social connection, loneliness, and isolation. You'll note, and I'm sure you've seen in the report, where these changes were made, it was sort of noted with a little asterisk. And this is because we felt in many cases that the questions, even though modified, were still comparable or could be benchmarked against previous years. I like to think about it not as apples and oranges, but Cosmic Crisp and Honey Crisp. And then last but certainly not least, significant respondent turnout. In previous years, we've set a goal of 600 surveys. That level of survey return from our statistically valid sample for a community of our size gives us a 95% confidence interval that the results that we're getting are within about 4 to 5% on either side of the percentage. We decided to up that goal. Maybe we were a little intimidated by the light rail survey and all the responses they got, but we decided let's set a goal this year of 700. And we were pleasantly, that's selling ourselves a little short. We were excited to see that we had 825 responses from our statistically valid sample. We have a theory about a few things that were probably happening that led to this. One of which is that we changed our outreach a bit this year to be more robust, and that our outreach to the general public, not just the random sample, started earlier in the survey process. Also, we have a feeling that likely our community is feeling very activated right now, that if there's a government listening, they'd like to be able to share their thoughts and responses. And we think that probably led to a higher response rate than we've seen in previous years. All that to say, we're very excited about the turnout and the results that we're going to share. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here in a moment to be able to turn it over to Derek Harvey from the ETC Institute to present a bit more about what we found.
Okay, Derek, I think we've got the presentation up, and so we are ready whenever you're ready to start.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I couldn't find the mute button. Thank you, Dale, for that introduction to the survey. Like you said, my name's Derek Harvey. I'm a project manager here from ETC Institute. Thank you, Council, for having me tonight virtually to present the results. There we go. Dale did a great job introducing ETC Institute. This slide just goes over more of our background. We're one of the nation's leading provider of market research for local governments. Since 2012, we've surveyed more than 1,200 communities around the world and have done surveys in all 50 states. As of this spring, we finally got Hawaii crossed off our list. And we've been in business since 1983. And really, since the last 30 years or so, we've really been focused on these community surveys, parks and rec surveys, and really focusing and working with local governments, cities, and counties as well. For the presentation tonight, I'm going to go through several of the major topics that we had on the survey. Overall perceptions of Issaquah, major city services, public safety, infrastructure, communication, and then finally opportunities for improvement. And at the end, I will leave time for questions if there are any. The purpose of the survey, like Dale mentioned, was we wanted to objectively assess the city's programs and services. We wanted to gather that input from the residents to help city leaders set priorities for the community. And we also wanted to identify those areas of improvement for the community. We administered the survey by mail, phone, and online. We mailed the survey to all the residents that were randomly selected to take the survey. Once they got it, it had a cover letter that explained the purpose of the survey. It told them they could go online and take the survey. There was phone numbers on there they could call to take the survey if they had any questions. We also did follow-ups by text, email, and social media. The sample was designed to ensure results are statistically valid and representative. We took your city shape files when we selected the sample, and then we took all the residential addresses within your city's shape files, and that's what we drew the random sample from. So everybody in the city had the same percentage chance of being selected for the survey when we did that. Like Dale said, our goal was 700. It was higher than the last time we did that, but we did receive a great turnout when it came back to the survey. 825 completed surveys, I think was higher than even what ETC would expect or anybody expected here. And that gave us a margin of error about 3.4% at the 95% level of confidence. I like to include this slide as a general overview slide of the results. I like to pull out three key numbers here. First one's the 96%. That's the percentage of respondents who rated Issaquah's overall quality of life as excellent or good. That's extremely high compared to other communities nationally and regionally, and we'll get into that a little later. And then 96% of also rated Issaquah as an excellent or good place to live. And as you can see below, plus 46 points. That's the difference between the national average and Issaquah's rating as a place to live. So Issaquah is doing very well in that area. A couple of other things, perceptions of the city remain high. Like I said, when compared to ETC Institute's Northwest and national averages for core services, Issaquah is performing above the averages in most of the areas assessed. And when we looked at the trends since the last survey, the trends have stabilized from 2023. Overall satisfaction with major services is strong. Overall, Issaquah is performing well in key areas such as fire and ambulance service, parks and rec facilities, and police services. And then finally, the opportunities for improvement. We designed the instrument to develop priorities for the city, flow of traffic, land use and planning, and how well Issaquah is planning for the future growth were highlighted as areas for improvement as well. Like I said, when we selected the sample, we took your city shape files. This is what those shape files look like when we get them. And then we select all the residential addresses from within that for the sample. While we're collecting responses, we're monitoring the distribution of the responses to ensure that each area of the city is being heard from. This is something ETC does on the back end once we're receiving surveys. If we see an area that is not sending back surveys in a way, we thought we would follow up in that area more. We might send a postcard to that area. We might try to focus more follow-ups in that area to make sure that all areas are being heard from. And as you can see, we did a great job here, especially with 825 respondents. These dots are to the block level for each one. So this is not their actual address. It goes to the nearest block level. That's why some of these dots are stacked very closely together. The first topic is the perceptions of Issaquah. As you can see, Issaquah received ratings above 50% in 9 out of the 10 areas assessed here. We are already pointing out the overall quality of life and as a place to live. But as a place to raise children also received 91% of your respondents rating it as excellent or a good place to raise children. Your lowest areas were Issaquah as a place to retire, but that still received ratings above 50%, and we'll look at the benchmarking there in a little bit. And then Issaquah as a place to open business was the lowest one, but that was still very close to that 50% mark that I usually look for these services. On this side, the big ones I typically look at when I get any survey results are the as a place to live and as a place to raise children. If those areas in the survey are high, most likely residents are going to be very satisfied with the area. If they like to live in the city and they like to raise their children there, they're most likely happy with where they live. Now the opposite is true. If they're not happy where they live and they're not happy to raise their children there, we're going to see that in the results as well. But we did not see that with Issaquah. When we looked at the trends for Issaquah remained stable from the last survey in 2023. Only a few areas saw decreases, but they weren't big decreases. Most of everything stabilized into a what I would like to see for most of these, since some of these areas are very highly rated. Going much higher is not really an option in some of these areas. So as long as they're stable, I think we're going in the right direction. And then when we looked at benchmarking, ETC has our own benchmarking services. We have a national benchmark of a survey we send out nationally, and we do that every summer to 5,000 residents nationwide. And we keep that database for core questions and core services. And then we also have a regional database that's developed by targeting states in different areas. So for Issaquah, we had the Northwest average. And that's the Northwest region, and that's the two that we compared Issaquah's service or results with. And as you can see, Issaquah's leading the way in all of the areas assessed here. They're above the regional national averages in almost all the areas. The only one that is right there with the national averages as a place to retire. That comes and goes with the overall news and how people are feeling about the economy. I find if news with the economy is trending upward, we start seeing the retirement trend up. If it's going down, we see it trend down. And that's usually why most scores are right there with the national or benchmarks and the Northwest benchmarks. When we looked at the major city services, more than half of the respondents were satisfied in 14 out of 17 areas assessed. As mentioned earlier, fire and ambulance services at 92%, parks and rec programs and facilities at 87%, and police services at 80% were your 3 highest rated services, with respondents being very satisfied in those areas. The bottom areas were public transportation at 47%, still pretty close to that 50% number that we like to see. And then land use, planning and zoning at 38%, and flow of traffic at 26% was the lowest. When we looked at the trends for major city services, some areas such as public art and arts programs seen big increases since 2023. Public arts and arts programming is up almost 9% since the last survey. That's a very significant jump in the results. And then as Dale mentioned earlier, some of the answer options were changed. And as you can see on the slide towards the bottom, those changes from previous years have been noted in the results. So you can see what they were before and what they were turned to now when you're analyzing these. When we looked at benchmarking for major city services, Issaquah once again is above the regional and national averages in almost all the areas assessed. The only one being lower was the flow of traffic on streets in Issaquah when looking at the national regional averages. And I always like to include the note that though some of the services may have rated lower than expected, when put into context with benchmarking, Issaquah is doing very well. Without the benchmarking, we don't really know where we stand up or how other communities are doing. It kind of gives us a picture of where the results stand in the bigger format or area. And then finally, opportunities for improvement for major city services. We had our important satisfaction assessment. We designed the survey to be able to create these opportunities for improvement. By doing this, we asked respondents to rate their satisfaction with all those services that we listed. I think there were 17 of them. And then immediately after that, we asked them, all right, now which are your the most important services for you or your household or for the city of Issaquah to focus on over the next 3 years? And then using this, we're able to create our important satisfaction matrix, which identifies areas for improvement. For major city services, that was flow of traffic. No surprise there, that being our lowest satisfaction level, and the importance rating was quite high there. Land use planning and zoning also had low satisfaction numbers, and then economic vitality was also an area identified. You can also see on here, you can see your areas where you were exceeding expectations from your residents. This just means that there was lower importance there when they selected that, but there was higher satisfaction there than what residents were on the importance level. And then continued emphasis areas are areas of higher importance and higher satisfaction as well. So residents are satisfied with parks and rec and programs and facilities, police services, and maintenance of city streets, sidewalks, and infrastructure. But that's also an important thing to them that they want to maintain. And it's very important to them. So that's why those would show up there. When looking at public safety, Issaquah received ratings above 50% in 8 out of the 11 areas assessed. Fire and EMS services were in the top area, as you can see, how quickly they respond to emergencies and the overall quality of fire and EMS services. Overall feeling of safety was the 3rd highest, and then police response times were the 4th highest. The lowest rated one is availability of information about police programs and activities. That comes down to communication that we'll get into later. Communication sources or sources of information that residents are looking to as well. And we'll jump into that a little later. When we looked at the trends, Issaquah's public safety trends have remained consistent over the last 4 years. Pretty much all the numbers have stayed the same or have reverted back to the 2021 trends as well, especially in 4 out of the 5 areas. They've gone back to the 2021 numbers after a slight dip in 2023. When we looked at benchmarking, Issaquah is leading the way in several of the areas assessed. The only one being the fire education programs in your community, where the Northwest region is slightly above you guys there. And then when we looked at the important satisfaction assessment matrix for public safety, only one public safety area was assessed as a category, as an area of improvement, and that was response to property crime. It's very important to the residents, and satisfaction was lower in that area. Areas where continued emphasis are needed are the overall feeling of safety in Issaquah, how quickly police respond to emergencies, and the visibility of police around the city. When we looked at infrastructure services, respondents rated all the areas here assessed over 50% satisfaction. These are extremely high scores. I rarely see very many communities with infrastructure scores this high. Adequacy of street lighting and street repair were the lowest rated items. And even the street repair was at 55% satisfaction, which is very high. When we looked at trends have remained stable over the past few years. Only a few areas have seen slight drops, storm drainage being one. Adequacy of street lighting in your community has seen a drop since 2021, and then street repair has also gone down, but it's stabilized in the past 2 years. When we looked at benchmarking, Issaquah is leading the way again in almost all the areas assessed. The only area that is adequacy of street lighting in your community, and you're right there with the benchmarking. So though it was the lowest rated item, when you look at other communities, you're doing right with them when it comes to that. So once again, when we get benchmarking in the picture, it makes the numbers get more context to them. For the important satisfaction assessment matrix for infrastructure, 3 areas were categorized as areas of opportunity for the city: street repair, adequacy of street lighting, and condition of sidewalks. Those are 3 big areas for all communities. I think I've only seen 2 communities in my 2 years at ETC Institute that haven't had street repair or road condition or road repairs as one of the top areas for opportunity. Everybody always thinks the roads need to be better, so that's no surprise. And adequacy of street lighting was the lowest rated item, so that's also not a surprise there. Continued emphasis was the maintenance of local parks, condition of city parks, and drinking water. And then last topic here is communication. When we asked respondents to identify which sources of information they use to get information about the city and its activities, events, and services, the top sources or major sources of information was the city website, word of mouth, and city digital newsletters. The last one being the local government cable channel and city council and other public meetings. We also asked the question in the survey: if the city were to print and mail a paper or quarterly newsletter, would you find this to be a valuable source of information about the city and its activities, events, and services? 72.4% of respondents said yes, that would be valuable to them. But as you can see, we did leave an open-ended response so that respondents could leave comments about this. And as you can see, a digital newsletter would be good. Email newsletter would be best. Some people miss the Issaquah Press. Some said include the newsletter update with utility bills. Of course, some people want the old paper still. And then a website for what's happening in the city. There's also a comment that was thrown in there as well. When we looked at opportunities for improvement for every section on that we covered in the survey, these were the following areas that were categorized as opportunities. The major city services we discussed: the flow of traffic, land use, planning and zoning, economic vitality and development, infrastructure with street repair, adequacy of street lighting in your community, and condition of sidewalks. When we looked at mobility, traveling by car in Issaquah was the top rated one. Ease of public transportation to or from Issaquah, and ease of public transportation in Issaquah. When we looked at growth and development, availability of affordable quality housing, and how well Issaquah is planning for future growth were the 2 that came up there. And social and economic vitality, cost of living in Issaquah, and support for those in need were the 2. City leadership and services, value received for your local tax dollars and fees, and support for those in need was also highlighted there. And then public safety we discussed was response to property crime. Thank you once again for inviting me virtually tonight. It was an honor to present to the council. If you have any questions, I can take them now.
Okay, I will look around. Wealth of information that we get every 2 years. And so starting out, do we have any questions? I know a lot of this is about absorbing the information and then kind of talking it over, thinking it through. So I'm not, okay. Councilmember Ray.
For that 2 people who are watching on TV tonight, can we get a link to where the Power BI is so we can do some our own deep sea diving? I think that would be amazing. And then this is kind of a philosophical question, but there are some things that end up in the upper left quadrant, the exceeds expectations, which is their importance rating isn't as high as some others. And I don't know if this is something that we've seen before, or if this is, I'm just making this up, but things that we really do well on tend to get discounted a bit, and so it's not as high in the importance rating. And I'm just looking at, quite honestly, I was looking at fire and ambulance, which I can't believe is not like rated as super important, but I think it's because it's rated so highly that it's discounted. So I guess I'm looking for some insights on if that is there something to that, or am I just making stuff up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what you have to remember about those matrices is that the importance rating, though fire and emergency is lower, it's only being compared to the ones that are on that matrix. So, and we only allowed the people to select 4 when they selected that. So that's why because the city is performing so well in that area, that's where it could be sliding down that importance rating compared to those other options that went over into the continued emphasis. And that's just something to remember when you're looking at it. It's only being compared to what's on that screen and not to every service that is in the city.
That kind of confirms what I was thinking. I'm just looking at the continued emphasis has parks and rec programs and facilities as in that box where fire and ambulance is not. And that just, I mean, I'm not saying that people didn't vote with their hearts or didn't honestly do it, but that just seems to me to be skewed by some other influence. So.
You mean you don't want us to cut everything that's in the less important?
Yeah, well,
I don't think that's what the data is telling us, but.
But one could argue that
Yeah.
the exceeds expectation means we are putting too many resources into those things, and because it's not as important. So, and I don't think that's right. So I guess, I appreciate the insights, and then it's really a question of how do you interpret that and understand that there are some limitations to every study. So thank you for that.
Great.
You're welcome.
Any other questions coming through? Okay, and so we have an opportunity for public comment. Do we have any interest in the audience, or is there anybody online for public comment?
We do have a member of the public with us online.
Okay, so if you're online and want to make a comment, you can press *3 if you're using the phone, or if you're on a smartphone or computer device, you will look for the raise hand icon, or you can send the host a chat message. And so for each of our items tonight, we have an opportunity for public comment. And so I will just wait a moment and see if there are any interest in public comments on this item. Okay,
I'm not seeing anything.
none, we will continue on and make the same request after each of the other 2 items. So, council direction. I think at this point, it's a lot of absorb the information, but is there anything specific you're looking for from us?
There is nothing specific at this time. I will just take a moment briefly to share with you timing and next steps, so you have an idea of where this is headed. So Councilmember Ray anticipated one of the next steps, which is to share with you the updated interactive dashboard. We'll also share the survey results. Oh goodness, brought me all the way back to the beginning. I should have known. There we go. We'll also share the survey results, the report, and the interactive dashboard to the public on our website, where we have previous year's reports as well. It will also go out in the Insider and over social media. I've been in communication with our communications team about some opportunities to highlight certain parts of the survey results through Uniquely Issaquah, so be on the lookout for some of that sharing in upcoming weeks. The administration and city staff will also continue to take a dive into this data, especially at some of the cross-tabulation with the demographic and geographic, which I think through the nods I'm seeing is the place where we all really want to dig in. And then you will have, of course, time with this information at your upcoming council retreat in July. And so that's a little bit about where this is headed in the near term.
Yes, go ahead, Council Member Joe.
Thank you for all your hard work on this. I had an idea that kind of came to me. Do we give the citizens an opportunity to comment on the results? I don't know if you've ever done that before, but we put the results up there and we just assume everyone's going to read it and agree with it, or if they really want to disagree with it, they can write an email to us. But if we gave them an opportunity to comment on the results, like yes, no, I agree with this one, or I don't, and why, it could give us more valuable feedback in terms of the information that we're able to receive. I thought the information that we had there was very robust, and the comments were intriguing, but perhaps opening up to everybody might give us even more information. Have you ever seen that in a process you've done before?
I've seen it in other processes. I've often seen it not necessarily through, like, I'm imagining what you're saying as sort of a social media campaign or some other way to sort of engage. I've seen it done where you take a survey and then you bring it to a focus group and you get responses in that focus group on how real does this seem? And we do have a mechanism in the survey. We do invite anyone that's interested in engaging further to give us their contact information. And that information is not associated directly with their responses on the survey. ETC does a great job making sure that's pulled out. I love that idea, and I'll definitely relay that as I meet with communications about how we might communicate out to the community on this one.
Yeah, I'm entrusting you with kind of forming it in a correct way where we just don't open the floodgates, but we actually get some, important and relevant information. So thank you for that.
Councilmember Hall?
Ditto that. I think that's an interesting idea to be able to communicate out with the community about this. So thank you, and thank you, ETC, very much. I know I'm gonna probably be chewing on this and digesting it for months to come until the retreat. So a couple kind of high-level takeaways that I had just from reading over the weekend was, there's this big desire for emphasis with regards to infrastructure, including sidewalks, road maintenance, streetlights, public transit. I think that'll be something meaningful that we'll need to watch over time too, especially because we did have to find cost savings in pavement management and concrete management in the last budget cycle. So thought that should be something we should put a pin in, especially because it does seem, both just from our experience being out in the town and also now, that people are still just driving around by themselves primarily, and over biking, over busing, over walking. So something to be mindful of. Planning for future growth. I think this was the first survey where community survey where I really had a good grasp on what we were asking. I mean, sometimes they'll prioritize things like land use and zoning, and it'd be like, that's not a very commonly understood concept in community. Like, what are we really trying to get out of there? This survey and your memo, Dale, too, seemed to indicate it was really wanting a focus on affordable housing, so that kind of came through there. And then also planning for future growth was a phrase that came out a lot. It reminds me of a phrase I hear from community members daily when I'm out in community or just in meetings, that why doesn't growth pay for growth, right? And so it makes me think, okay, we need to be doing some more messaging ourselves when we're in community and as a city around how challenging that is. There are so few tools for us to actually accomplish that. I mean, people think, well, if there's a bunch of housing coming in, why isn't there major road development and infrastructure going in first to be able to do that? There's a lot of state laws that limit our ability to do anything like this. So anyways, that was just something that came to mind. Emphasis on property crime. We have this kind of policy question or just kind of exploration of what would it look like if we only did mandatory offense bookings later in the meeting today. This goes to show, at least for me, that we should continue booking both, right? Property crime, I think, fits into that non-mandatory offense category. So, and that's really one of our only tools that we have to really dissuade organized retail theft at a high level. Yeah, so anyways, just wanted to say that. I think it lends support to kind of potential additional resources around emergency management that we heard about a few weeks ago. I think we need to take this paper newsletter idea kind of seriously and kind of chew on it. Like, what was it? 3 out of 4 people said, yeah, we'd find value in a paper newsletter. So I'm going to rely on kind of the communications team and the administration to kind of chew on that idea a bit. And then I think it's clear that cost of living, I mean, every survey we get, it's clear cost of living rises very close to the top. People are struggling. It's a challenging time. People are stretching every dollar they earn. Even the task force on facilities is wanting to have a broader conversation around cost of living right now. Is this a good time? So anyways, those are just kind of some of my high level reflections on it all. And thanks again.
Councilmember Ray?
I have one more question. So in addition to the statistically valid survey done by ETC, we also did a, hey, everybody, if you want to fill out the survey, we'd love to hear from you. I'm kind of curious if you have looked at the 2 sets of results and how do they compare?
I have the raw data. I have not yet put them side by side quite yet. So we received an additional 146 responses. It will be interesting to see similarities and differences geographically and demographically, because that has often been a real driver in the difference in the priorities. But that is a later this week activity. So
Yeah.
it will be ready for you for July.
That'd be cool. I mean, I'm just really curious because one population opted in, and so they had a different kind of motivation than the survey showed up and I was asked to participate. And so I'm just curious to see if they're similar, dissimilar, how they vary. So thank you for doing that. That'll be just fascinating to see.
Deputy Council President DiMichele?
Thank you. Just following up on Councilmember Joe and Councilmember Hall's comments, if we were to have a focus group, the one area when I was looking at it that I had more questions was this idea of flow of traffic. Was like, my first impression was, oh, that's Front Street in Newport and Highlands Drive. And then I thought, well, I don't know that for sure. It would be really nice to sit down with a group of people and what did you mean when you said flow? And are we talking about great big construction projects, or are we talking about little fixes like making it easier to take a right-hand turn? Those little fixes that sometimes get the flow working great. So, I think the idea that we ask people their further thoughts about what they were thinking when they filled out the survey would be actually very enlightening. The other thing I noticed is only 2% of the people said that they actually take transit, but then it ended up with one of the lowest scores in satisfaction. And so it does make sense, but it also says to me, are there a lot of people out there that if we had better transit services, they would be potential customers? And so again, sitting down with people and going a little bit deeper, delving a little deeper into what the responses were, I think would be a really good idea. So I just want to plus one everything that was said earlier. And the last thing is I did go and read all the comments at the end. They're always the best part of any survey. Issaquah people don't mince words, do they? I would commend anybody to that. It's the last piece of the data that we received, but it was well worth sitting and reading through all of those. And yeah, this is like you said, it's going to take some time for us to absorb all this information. Thank you.
Councilmember Zhang?
Yeah, I wanted to second what everyone said so far, and like Deputy Council President DiMichele, I did have a great time reading through all the comments, which also, provides some color on specific, traffic issues that folks had. One comment that really stuck with me about the traffic thing specifically was this perception that we think, this person had the perception that, we have no plan to solve traffic other than hoping that widening Highway 18 is going to solve all of our problems. And I think, maybe that's not what we're actually saying, but that's the message that they've gotten through the messaging. And so I think we need to emphasize, actually, maybe part of how we solve traffic is making it so that people don't have to drive to the store and they can walk in their neighborhoods, and like those types of things, like, kind of expanding what the solution space looks like and what we're talking about. Because I think especially given what we're seeing at the state level, that's not something we can be relying on. And I think one thing interesting in the comments as well was that, there's obviously people that like basically fundamentally disagree on some issues. Like some people are like, oh, we should do this. And some people say, no, we should do the exact opposite of that. So it's interesting to see both. And, there's a diversity of opinions within our community. And ultimately, it's our job to kind of parse through all of that and figure out, what's the direction that makes sense for our community, and we aren't necessarily always going to make everyone happy. Also to go to what Councilmember Ray was saying earlier, things that people think are going well get, discounted in importance. Things that people think aren't doing well get boosted up in importance. Like everyone's like, oh, traffic's the biggest issue because it's not going well. But if the emergency services were not arriving on time, that would immediately become the biggest issue. So I think it's, it's interesting just to see how that kind of affects people's perception of importance. And yeah, I think it's great that, so many folks responded to the survey. I definitely got a lot of social media ads telling me to participate, so the outreach worked. But yeah, definitely a lot to digest.
Okay, I think you're going to hear much of the same from me, that this is a lot of good information, and I do agree with my fellow council members that there's a lot to digest, but, there are some things that people pay attention to because it's one piece, whereas I think it is really important to continue to go back to that 96% of people think this is a great place to live. And in fact, I think that is quite surprising to see on a survey. You think people respond to something usually because they're upset, because they're frustrated at something. And in this case, what we are seeing is people are giving their opinions on the place that they live and the fact that they love it here. So I will be very interested to hear from council members, as you absorb this information, how you want us to talk about it at the July retreat. Your council leadership always has, the push and pull of, hey, we want to be responsive to a lot of things, but we also recognize we're in the first portion of a 2-year budget. And so how we look at those types of things and take in this information. I think I will, in some ways, disagree with something that you said, Councilmember Hall, in that I still don't know what land use and zoning means to most people. I think through the comments, you could absolutely see that there was a lot of concern about cost of living and affordable housing, but I'm still not sure that is what most people mean, or even that most people agree with each other on land use and zoning. And so I would be really interested in future years if we just separated that out. I think we really need clarity over whether the more important issue to people is affordable housing or housing affordability, the built environment, infrastructure, other things like that. I think people's concerns about traffic can become concerns about housing when we could disaggregate them again with that idea of having things that people didn't have to get in their car for and other things. And so when we look at land use and zoning and see that people are concerned about it, but don't know whether they're concerned that there are many houses and thus they think traffic, or there aren't enough houses and my kids can't move here, I think we just need to get a better, clearer answer on that. I was really interested in the number of people that were said yes to a printed newsletter, and so I think we definitely should think through that. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting in looking through the comments from folks was how many people, you would think with the high school and the middle school and all of the traffic in the area that a lot of people would just be upset that there's a lot of traffic, but I saw quite a shift in perception on this one, that people recognized that it was because the high school, Issaquah High School, is overcrowded, and that they really wanted us to work with the school district to get that fourth high school built in order to reduce that traffic. So I thought that was a very interesting shift in people's perspectives, that it wasn't just those darn high schoolers that are cutting through traffic, but rather this is a problem because we have too many students because we haven't been able to build the fourth high school. So those were some of the things that I heard off of that. Again, I will be very interested as anything comes up, how you would like to discuss this at the retreat. Dale, anything else that you need off of this?
Not on this topic.
Okay. Well, Derek, thank you for joining us for this and giving us the information on this. Our next item is COM 0146, Informational Update 2024 Citywide Performance Measures. Wow, Dale, you're up here again. This is the Dale Markey Crimp evening. So item number 2 of 3 for you coming through.
Give me 1 second to pull it up. Great. Thank you, Council President. Members of the City Council, Dale Markey Crimp, Assistant to the City Administrator, and I'm looking forward to talking to you a bit about the next item on the agenda, the 2024 Citywide Performance Measures. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to provide the City Council with an annual update on the citywide performance measures. Specifically, to provide the data and performance from 2024, this most recent year, to present some trends and analysis of the performance, and to share a few planned changes and updates for 2025. In terms of direction needed this evening, this is an informational update, so there is no specific direction needed from the City Council on this item at this time. However, I'm looking forward to taking questions and hearing your thoughts. By way of a bit of background for the council, for the 2 people listening on cable at home, the citywide strategic plan, the city's first citywide strategic plan, the Our Issaquah Strategic Plan, was adopted in 2019. It seems to be the origin of many things that I come to talk to you about. And following that adoption, the citywide performance measurement plan was developed in 2020 to make concrete a plan for tracking progress towards the strategic plan's goals and objectives. And this plan was adopted by the council in late 2021 in late 2020 alongside the 2021 budget. Since 2021, the focus of this plan has been on collecting and understanding data and performance related to the measures in the plan, using it to, where appropriate, modify and adjust programs and projects and lines of service here at the city. In 2024, the administration led an effort to update the strategic plan, which included suggested updates to the plan's success measures to align with each plan objective. The performance measurement plan that was adopted by council in 2020 is organized by our 6 strategic plan goal areas. It provides specific measures that make more observable and measurable progress towards the strategic plan success measures. It's a mix of measures, so it's a mix of output measures, program outcome measures, community perception measures, a bunch of which we just heard about from our vendor at ETC, and what I have colloquially called vital signs, these sort of community level health indicators that aren't necessarily, you can't draw a straight line from them to any one program, project, series of projects, and are often very hard to shift over short periods of time because they're the confluence of many different actors. You can see here not only a definition of each of these types of measures, but also some examples of those measures from our performance measurement plan. On this slide, you can also see that there's the idea here is that they're intended to give an idea of how we're doing in pursuit of our strategic plan. These measures didn't just come out of thin air. They were very much intended to help us understand if we're making progress towards the vision and goals outlined in the plan. The purpose of the plan is to help city departments set service levels and modify and adjust service delivery. It's to help the city council and inform budgetary and policy decisions based on performance. And it's also helpful to provide our residents and our business owners, our visitors, our broader community with increased transparency into how we are performing as an organization. Another important facet of the performance measurement plan is our citywide performance dashboard. This dashboard is interactive. It was launched in 2022, and it provides any interested party, it's available publicly on the web, with a way of looking at the data, the performance data over time. So being able to see from the earliest data we have on some of these measures, which for many measures actually predates the performance measurement plan, all the way up to the most recent year to see how our performance has improved or vacillated or in some cases not improved over time. This dashboard is updated annually. It is currently updated with 2024 data. It actually also has some 2025 survey data in it as well, but it is set for 2024. And improvements were made in 2023 to ensure some improvements were made to ensure the clarity of information in the dashboard was improved. I think specifically some feedback we received from the community was that it was hard to understand exactly how year-over-year performance had changed. And so we made some changes into how we reported to make that percentage change more available to the public. For the update today, and you have a lot more information than what I am going to necessarily walk through this evening, but for tonight's informational update, I wanted to provide some overarching trends, performance by goal area, and some thoughts specifically on measures where the city has not seen improvement over the course of the last 4 to 5 years. We'll start with the good, which you can see here on the screen. 75% of measures that have targets were approaching meeting or exceeding those targets in 2024. We're still waiting on data for 2 measures in social and economic vitality, and we'll get to those in a moment, which is why the aggregate count is lower than it was in 2023, but we'll see that aggregate count come up when we have that data in early June. Also, in 2024, we only had 14 targets that were not met. While this is not the lowest percentage of targets not met, it is the strongest overall performance that we've seen since the inception of the program in 2021 and the establishment of targets for all measures where appropriate. I think one of the most notable trends in this graph is seeing over time that TBD, targets TBD, has gone down from prior to the program existing, having almost all didn't have targets to now being at a place where we only really have 2 measures for which targets are appropriate and are still to be determined. So that's encouraging to see here over time. All goal areas in 2024 were somewhere between 60 and 80% approaching, meeting, or exceeding their targets. And you can see in the chart a significant improvement in each goal area from 2014 to 2024. I know that color scheme is not always the most visually inclusive way to share data, but I do think there's something pretty powerful about this visual and seeing lots of red to the left and seeing it turn progressively greener to the right here. This indicates to me that there's a pretty significant impact of just putting a focus and attention on data collection and reporting in the first place. You can't improve what you're not looking at and what you're not attending to. And I think given that the focus of our program over the last 4 to 5 years has really been reporting and talking about the data itself, we're already seeing improvement just from knowing that this is something we should be looking at, that we're going to be talking about and sharing about. Also, I think notable here is there's and this actually came up also in Derek's presentation about the community survey, is this sort of vacillation or leveling out in recent years. We're seeing that stabilization in our community survey responses. We're also seeing a little bit of stabilization here in performance. And that suggests that some targets are likely spot on and are in the right place. In places where we're not continuing to see improvement, it bears asking whether or not those targets are appropriate or there's additional resources and investment needed in some particular areas. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this presentation. Now I'd like to share just high level from each goal area, just a few trends, provide a little bit of commentary on each of these. It should be noted that in the interactive dashboard, you can see a narrative explanation of current year performance for any of these measures. So you might notice, oh, Dale didn't talk about that specific measure and its performance. I'm going to focus more on where we're not meeting our targets, but I do also want to note where we've seen improvement, because we have seen some things change in the past year that's pretty encouraging. So starting with mobility, performance was approaching, met or exceeded for 67% of measures where targets were appropriate in mobility. In terms of things of the 4 where we met targets, we're meeting the level of service commitments to fill potholes. That's not new. But we did also see year-over-year increases, although small, in public transit and van pool use. So following the COVID-19 pandemic, we really set an annual goal for some of these services on just seeing increases year over year. And it was encouraging to continue to see those increases in 2024. In terms of targets where we were approaching our targets, for each of these measures, performance was just below the target, or even in the case of traffic related to collisions, collisions on Issaquah streets, it was within the margin of error. So potentially, I had a nice long argument with our Public Works engineering team about whether or not this qualified as meeting or approaching, and I decided to go with approaching. They argued it was technically meeting the target, but within the margin of error there, given the number of drivers on the street. In terms of not met, there are 3 performance measures where we did not meet our targets. I'm here to assuage some of your fears. In terms of linear feet of bicycle facility constructed and walkways constructed, we didn't meet our general annual target. However, the focus in 2024 was not to construct new bikeway or walkway. It was to maintain our current bikeway and walkway infrastructure. And so this involved a lot of work on high edges. It involved a lot of work on curb ramp replacement, and also a lot of work on cleaning and maintaining bike lanes. Also, if you look at the historical data, we're still far exceeding our construction goals, our general construction target. Last year, I think it was over double. And so I've been assured that we shouldn't worry too much about not meeting that this year. One to keep an eye on, though, and we'll come back to, is resident perception of mobility. We have not met our goal for our overall resident perception of different mobility modes since 2014. Satisfaction with public transit actually was up slightly. This might be due to Metroflex, but car satisfaction has dropped 9% since 2023. And so that's important to notice as well. And then targets to be determined, car travel time. I think this, for those of you old hat at this, we had a very brief, very wonderful contract with INRIX where we were able to get a bunch of car travel time data on specific segments throughout the city. That contract did not extend past 2022. And so while we mined out as much data as we could, our Public Works engineering team is currently in the process of identifying a new vendor contractor who will be able to provide us car travel time data. And so they're in the final stages of that, but hopefully we'll be able to update this and then establish some goals in the coming year. Growth and development. Performance approached, met, or exceeded targets for 60% of measures in growth and development where targets were appropriate in 2024. I think encouraging to see here was meeting some of our first permit review times for the first time in as long as I have put this data together for you all. So in small tenant improvement, large tenant improvement, commercial and multifamily, and preliminary plat, actually meeting those targets. And that's not something that's been the case in previous years. In terms of approaching targets, we've stayed relatively constant in the number of permits issued by type. The goal is, the target there is to keep a relatively constant number. It did dip slightly in 2024, and so that moved from meeting to approaching. And then in terms of targets not met, first permit review time, we're still not meeting our target for single family or for short plat. Affordable housing units created, the target is a year-over-year increase. But as we know well, development comes in spurts. We've had 54 new affordable units created in the past 6 years, but we have not seen any new affordable units created in the last 2. And then permit center customer experience. This is actually the first year that we've missed our satisfaction target for this one. We have a target of 70% satisfied based on those that fill out the survey. The conversation actually about our survey methodology came up and whether or not we're actually providing the survey at the right time to folks. The current approach is to provide it twice a year to anyone that's engaged in services in the past 6 months, rather than getting it at point of interaction. And so looking into seeing if we can get potentially some different or more accurate data versus the folks, I think as Council President Walsh brought up, people are really likely to fill out a survey when they had a bad experience. And the longer you get away from a good experience, the less likely you think that maybe you need to fill out that survey or not. So we're gonna look into whether or not methodology gives us different data and continue to toy with this one a little bit. Environmental stewardship. This continues to be, unsurprisingly, a place where the city really shines. Performance approached, met, or exceeded targets for 80% of measures in 2024 in this category. We have continued strong performance across these measures where we're meeting our targets. Notable is that energy use for the first time is on the correct trend line. It is only 1 year of data, so we clearly need to see if this continues, but it has been headed in the opposite direction over the course of the last 5 years. And so seeing a decrease in overall electricity use per capita, driven by a decrease in commercial electricity use in particular. So that was an interesting and new trend, not something that we've seen in the past 5 years. In terms of not met, materials diverted from landfill. I think important to note about this one, unlike some of our other measures, this doesn't have an annual target. So unlike electricity use, which says year over year, we want to see a decline, this doesn't necessarily say year over year, we want to see an increase in diversion. Instead, this is benchmarked against our 70% diversion goal. And we did see improvement, actually, in diversion this past year, but we're still far below our 70% diversion goal. So specifically, we saw a 4% increase in residential diversion, a 3% increase in commercial diversion, and a 1% increase in multifamily diversion. So challenges remain there, and I've spoken this week with our solid waste team about some of the strategies they're employing. So that's in a not met, but we'll talk about it a little bit later in terms of places where we haven't historically met our goals and maybe some potential next steps that we may want to take. And then to be determined, we have one measure here in environmental stewardship that we've only started gathering data on in the last 2 years. Because we've only gathered it for 2 years and because this isn't something that has a standard level of service at the state or federal level, we're still trying to determine exactly what our target should be in terms of percentage of city-owned streets receiving stormwater treatment. Social and economic vitality. Performance met, exceeded, or approached targets for 78% of the measures where targets exist and data has been collected. As I mentioned at the top, this is the one category that we're still waiting on data for 2 measures, specifically total jobs in Issaquah and percentage of people who work and live in Issaquah. That's data that we get externally, and we should have it in early June, and so we'll be able to update the data on the dashboard at that point. In terms of meeting targets, we continue to meet many targets in this particular goal area. There's been a positive trend, notably, in gross taxable income for Issaquah businesses in 2024, which is different than a downward trend that we saw in 2023. In terms of approaching, percentage of human services partners achieving 1 or more goals, we have an aspirational goal there of 100%, that 100% of our partners are achieving 1 or more of their goals. They get support from our human services staff. However, we often have new partners every year. So some of that support, ongoing support, doesn't necessarily translate when you've got a brand new organization you're supporting. And as I think our own data has demonstrated over time, that maybe looking at a goal for the first time or trying to pursue something for the first time, you may not hit that goal the first time around. So we're pretty close there, and we remain in approaching, but we have not yet hit that aspirational 100%. And I think that should bring us to city leadership and services, where I'll share that performance has met, exceeded, or was approaching targets for 67% of measures where applicable this past year. Some key places where we met our goals. Volunteerism is up, at least in terms of number of hours. So we've seen number of hours increase year over year as we've begun to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The number of unique volunteers, though, did drop slightly in 2024 compared to 2023. So more hours from slightly fewer people, which is just an interesting thing to think about, especially in some of the bigger conversations we're having about social cohesion, connection, and engagement. Continuing to keep police response times in a direction of improvement. This came up in the community survey. It's a place that our community feels fairly satisfied. We were not at any point, with the exception of 1 year, really missing our mark on any of our response times, but we've continued to see decreasing response times, which is a good thing, especially over the past couple of years. In terms of approaching targets, language access, another place where we have an aspirational goal of 100% of hard copy materials being translated into at least Spanish and Mandarin in addition to English. We saw a drop actually in 2024 from 90% to 85%. In talking with our communications team, this was due to some materials getting distributed before they could be translated. So comms is working on shoring up those processes with departments to make sure that does not happen moving forward. Resident perception on public safety is another place where we're still approaching our target. That 85% target is a holdover from our previous surveys. I'll bring this back up here in a moment, but one thing that we saw is that our performance in that is far outperforming regional and national averages, which begs the question, is that current target still an appropriate target to keep? And then not met, and you'll see all these show up again in just a moment, but racial equity training and anti-bias training hours, we continue to fall short of the target set for this in 2020. The demographics of city applicant, staff, board, and commission members being representative of our community. We've actually vacillated. We met that target a couple of years ago and have since seen reversion. And so that is something to think about as well. And then resident perception of customer service and services. This is a place where we continue to fall short of our internal goal, but a place where, at least over the last 2 surveys, we've been really lauded by ETC for outperforming our regional and national partners. And so just begs the question of, is it the right target, or should we be doing something different? And then last but certainly not least, if my infrastructure crew from the strategic plan update were here, they'd be very sad that we did this one last, as infrastructure is the foundation of all that we do. But encouragingly, performance met, exceeded, or approached 79% of the measures where a target has been set in the infrastructure goal area. We're continuing to meet service standards for most infrastructure systems. We had no water main breaks in 2024. I feel like I should knock wood on that one. but an exciting trend to see. In terms of approaching, we did see a improvement in sewer overflows, but we still had 2 this past year. And we fell short of our annual goal of cleaning 20% of the sewer system, 19.2%, which is, it's within scooping distance, but just short. And we also continue to fall short of our 80% goal on resident perception of water services. We had 2 targets that were decidedly not met. One is on the number of illicit discharge reports that are filed by residents. We have a goal to see this decrease year over year. I think this is a very odd measure to have a target for, given how little control the city has over what's reported. But I understand it as a vital sign that if community health, generally we'd want to see that target go down. It's just very hard to impact. And so if you look in the dashboard, you'll see we have years where we have many, and then few, and then many, and then few, and then many, and then few. And then stormwater services. And this came up in the community survey results as well. We saw a decrease overall in resident satisfaction with stormwater services when we switched survey vendors, but it has remained steady over the past 3 surveys, and it is above our regional and national benchmarks, but it remains low compared to water and sewer, which is just, I think, a notable thing to think about when we think about goals, we think about investments. So with that in mind, I do want to talk about a handful of measures where we have routinely missed targets since this program's inception. And you can see them here on the screen. Resident perception of mobility, permit review times for first review, even though, as I noted, we've seen some improvement in the most recent year. Percentage of materials diverted from landfill, again, although we've seen a positive direction in 2024. Total hours of racial equity and anti-bias training, the demographic representation of our applicants, staff, and board and commission members, resident perception of city services, and resident perception of stormwater infrastructure. Our targets, as a piece of history, when they were determined originally, were determined in a few different ways. Some were determined by state and federal requirements. Some were determined by previous performance. Some were determined by industry standards. Some were determined by performance in other communities that were already tracking this data, whether that was regionally or nationally. And some were aspirational goals. So we said, yeah, we want to hit 100% on this. When a measure over time continuously fails to meet a target or make progress towards a target, that may lead to consideration of a couple of different options moving forward. It may mean that target, or that measure just needs additional emphasis, and that could look like staff time and capacity. That could look like letting a program run longer. A few of these things we've recently made investments in, and now we're starting to see maybe a little bit of shift. Maybe we just need to let that run a little bit longer to see if it's going to stick. Financial investment, or it could be a new approach to raise a level of service or to build a better understanding of the community perception or to do some community education on some topics. Alternatively, it could also mean that a target needs to be reconsidered. That we have enough data at this point to say, I'm not sure this is the right target that we should be aiming at. This could be the case when we have data to indicate the city target might be too high, when there's no regional benchmark that exceeds our current performance, or we simply do not have the ability to commit more staff time, capacity, financial resources to the corresponding projects related to that measure and target. So in looking at the places where we've routinely fallen short of our expectations over the last few years, I think it's currently the thinking that this is sort of the best way to potentially to move forward with each of these measures. That mobility, first review times, and percentage of materials diverted from landfill fall into the category of continued emphasis, that there's some need to see through the investments we've already made. You are well familiar with the permit work that's being done. You're well familiar with solid waste, the new solid waste program, the new solid waste contract that's a few years old now. We're suggesting at this point, stay the course. In terms of some of these other measures on the right-hand side, you can see there's a little bit of a combo. In city leadership and services, there's a thinking that potentially our total hours of training for racial equity and implicit bias, which is at 5 hours a year, might be a little bit high. Where we want to do a little bit of learning as to how many hours are other jurisdictions having their staff do. That 5, especially, we're not suggesting lowering it to 1 hour or less, but 5 might be too many hours, given current staff capacity. Demographic representation of applicant staff and board and commission members. We think the reversion from meeting that target earlier in 2022 and 2023, we think it's worth re-emphasizing and better understanding why we saw that reversion. Some of this makes sense, what with our staff reductions in the past year, but really getting a better understanding of when folks, if they're leaving of their own choice, why they might be doing that. And so HR is aware of this trend and wants to look a bit more closely at why we might be trending in that direction. Resident perception of overall quality of city service and services. This is a tough one because it's one where I think we want to continue to hold a really high bar, but we are continually told by external actors like ETC, you're kicking it out of the park. 67, 66%, that's far above the national average. Should we be reconsidering our 80% goal? Not lowering it dramatically, it should still be aspirational, but should it be 70% based on what we're seeing nationwide? And then infrastructure. The stormwater, the resident perception of stormwater infrastructure has already been talked about. We've seen some reductions in pavement investment. What are things looking like in terms of stormwater infrastructure, in terms of the investment that we're making in our stormwater infrastructure? Is it keeping pace with water and sewer in a way that we would expect it to perform as highly in residents' perception in terms of how they feel about those services? So with that in mind, I want to give a brief update about what's going to look new and different in 2025, and then I'll pause for questions and feedback. As you well know, in 2024, the mayor established a community task force to provide recommendations on our Issaquah strategic plan. And those updates, which were focused on the objectives and actions within the plan, also had recommendations on revising and updating the success measures within the plan as they corresponded with the actions and objectives. Data on these new or revised measures in the plan is beginning this year in 2025. And starting in 2026, these measures will be incorporated into the annual performance measurement reporting. And so you should expect to see the data on the measures for which we will have data available when I'm back here presenting in a year's time. In terms of timing and next steps, we're going to continue to analyze and use the data from 2024 to modify and adjust our programs and projects in the current year. We'll continue to collect the data on our legacy measures, the ones that are in the original plan, and start collection on new measures here from the strategic plan update this year. And for all of you, continue to look at this data. Please take a look at the performance dashboard and know that you should feel free to use it alongside your community survey data at your retreat in July. And now I'll take questions.
Okay, Councilmember Zhang.
Are we allowed to give suggestions on specific metrics or things that we'd like to see, or is that not part of this discussion?
You can share them. In terms of, it won't be incorporated into changes in the plan, but I'm always eager to hear things that you'd like to see data on.
Okay, cool. So this is great. Thank you so much for tracking all this data. And, I think one of my friends who's a data scientist was like, wow, Issaquah has this dashboard that's available to the public. I can see how you're doing and everything. That's really cool for a city of 40,000 people. So I wanted to pass that feedback along. So on growth and development, when we were talking about the community survey earlier, it seems like affordability is a big concern to people. And there's really nothing in our growth and development metrics that's related to affordability other than the number of subsidized affordable housing units created. I would love to see something that's what percentage of units are affordable to, 30, 60, 80, 100% of AMI, and have that be something that we track every year, every other year. And that really does need to include naturally occurring affordable housing as well, not just subsidized units. On the environmental sustainability piece, I was very surprised that there's no explicit climate-related target here. There's nothing here that's like emissions per person needs to be going down. Instead, we have electricity use per person, which actually, when you're like, oh, commercial electricity use went down, is that actually a good thing? Like, that might be due to, declining commercial activity, which I don't know if that's good. And, as we're trying to get folks to move to EVs, heat pumps, electricity use is going to go up, and that's good. We should expect to see electricity growth, and so I think having that as our metric is kind of problematic, especially if we're not including things like how much gas are people putting in their cars to drive around, how much gas are people, natural gas are people using to heat their homes. Okay, on social and economic vitality, I think this could be an area where, some of the work that you've been doing on, social connectedness could fit in here as well, like some metric on the community survey of how connected do people feel with their communities. And also on the economic vitality piece, I think, stuff related, we've talked in previous meetings about how commercial space is a big concern for businesses in Issaquah, having data on like how much commercial space is there, what are the vacancy rates, so we can, have data on that. And then on the city leadership and services, I totally agree that the number of hours spent on equity training is maybe not the best metric, because that's not really something, it's like, if you're an average citizen of Issaquah and you're like, I want our city to support equity. I don't care if the city staff are, doing implicit bias training. The data on how well that works is honestly kind of mixed. And I think focusing more on, the actual results of demographic of city staff and board and commission members is more of like, a material outcome that we should be focusing on. So I think that's one that I agree that we should focus on.
Excellent. Councilmember Joe, questions?
Thank you. I wanted to continue the conversation on city leadership and services related to total hours of racial equity and implicit bias training and the demographic representation of city applicants. How do you view those two as being interconnected? In the sense that if we have HR, just to pick on HR because it does hire people, if they had more experience or more total hours of exposure to racial equity and implicit bias, does that change how we recruit and how we interview and how we perceive the candidates and accept candidates that might not fit the ideal profile for a pro quarterback or a human resources manager, whatever the case may be, right? And have you seen, in your experience, more hours equal better demographic representation or the opposite? And I'm wondering if you could take a look and see how they might be related and if there's any literature out there that could help inform our decisions a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. The theory would be that they do, that there is, maybe not a one-to-one, but there's some correlation. As Councilmember Jang brings up, the data on that is mixed, on the efficacy of that. The theory and the actuality is not necessarily always true, because simply sitting in training does not necessarily mean that it's effective training, doesn't mean that your perspectives or your lens has really grown or changed over time, too. So.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and it's kind of a new wild frontier for us in this area. It's something that we don't have a great deal of experience with. We have experiences that we might have in our heart and things that we might have perceived and seen, but is that real, actual data and data that you can tie to and study and learn from? So I would just be interested to see how that is coming along. Thank you.
Any other questions? Deputy Council President DiMichele.
And this may very well be explained when you look at the dashboard, but under social and economic vitality, the number of human services program beneficiaries supported through city funding, actually, that's one where we don't want the numbers to go up, I presume, because that means things are falling apart somewhere. So it says targets met. So tell me just a little bit about that. How is that measurement showing whether we're actually doing a good job or whether it is the environment that is in trouble?
Yeah, the real one that I look at when it comes to is the environment in trouble. And the reason we don't have a target is on the food bank measure in particular. So we know that we we don't want to set a target on how many members of the community are using the food bank. It's more of the vital sign. It's more of having an awareness of what's going on. In terms of our human services program beneficiaries supported through city funding, really in terms of that measure in particular, we're just keeping track of how many people are being reached. So it's not necessarily that we'd want to see it go up, but we're keeping an eye on just how effective are our dollars, our sort of dollar investment per capita. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, looking to the public, anybody online or in person that wants to make a comment. If you are on the phone, press *3. If you are on a smartphone or computer, raise the hand icon or send the host a chat message, and I will look around and see if there is any interest in making public comment. Not seeing any. Okay, going back to council members for any feedback. Who wants to start us off? Or are we just so impressed with all of the data and at this point just getting a little glazed over from everything that we are looking at? I guess my question kind of for Dale is you've represented a few areas where we, have not consistently met the goals and the criteria. And so you indicated a few where maybe we want to make adjustments, a few where we still feel like emphasis is needed. Is there any feedback from council members on that approach? Are we comfortable with the administration making those changes that have been highlighted here? Is there any, I'm just going to try and pull feedback out from you, Councilmember Hall.
Yeah, and I have some feedback there and some kind of general takeaways. I didn't raise my mic right at first because this stormwater thing is bugging me. It puzzles me to no end too. Because also this also seems like another thing that might not be like super well understood when someone says stormwater, like what a stormwater facility is in the first place is not generally understood because it can be so many different kinds of infrastructure. Anyways, there's really no way to, I'll just throw it out there. The racial equity and implicit bias training, I noticed in the packet or in the memo, there was a reference to council. Is the metric inclusive of council receiving training as well?
It's not currently. It's
Okay.
it's boards and commissions,
Okay.
not council.
Okay, thank you. All right, so anyways, general feedback, it did seem like things in general were trending in the right direction. Some notable exceptions in like growth and development, social and economic vitality, which like you mentioned goes really hand in hand with kind of what we heard from the community in the survey, especially around emphasizing housing and cost of living. Definitely a takeaway to continue all of our good work in permit review improvements and the landfill diversion programming, which you mentioned. Again, the stormwater bit is puzzling, and there's no answer in my brain there. I wonder if even that's a useful measure, because we have some other stormwater measures around discharge. Things that are more actually infrastructure-y that we can use something with. Resident perception of stormwater facilities. I don't necessarily know what I would do with that. So maybe that's something to churn on a little bit. I do agree with you that the 80% positive target for perception of overall city services seems high. I think you made a good case there, especially because really anyone can project anything onto that metric depending on what their last experience with the city was. So I would be in favor of kind of working on that measure, and then the other measures as you've identified here. I think you've got a good plan of attack. Those are general thoughts.
Okay. Councilmember Ray?
This may just because you just did the community survey, but I think it would be really interesting to superimpose related items from the community survey over your performance measures and see how those match up. So if we've got something where we're crushing the measure and yet satisfaction is low, maybe we need to figure out what's wrong with the measure. And conversely, if there's a target that we're missing, and satisfaction is high, that's one where I think you say, oh, maybe we're not measuring the right thing or we don't have the right target. And then, to help focus decision-making and policy building, where we're missing the target and the satisfaction is low, I think that intersection point is where it might be interesting for us to have a really hard discussion about priorities and how do we address those two things. But, I know there's not even one-to-one certainly, but I think you can correlate, these things kind of relate to those things, and see if there's any trends that pop out. And I think to the ones where you say, I think that this performance measure we need to adjust, I think pointing to something in the survey to say, they don't align. So just a thought.
I will also just throw out there, I will be interested to see the data points and the performance measures that the new update to the plan has asked for, partially because I think that was a really great update, and I'm interested to see how we are measuring those, but also because I don't want us to try and measure all of the things. I want to make sure that what we are doing is useful. And so if we are adding some, I would like to use that as an opportunity to just evaluate whether or not everything we are currently measuring is both useful and easy enough to get and, something that is easy to maintain so that we are not overburdening the system by adding and not removing. Councilmember Joe?
Thank you. I hope you can tell by the questions that are up here that we really appreciate what you do. It gives us valuable insights, and appreciate the hard work that you give day after day to put this information together. I was wondering if it would be possible to get the social and economic vitality information that comes out in June. Looks like we're awaiting measures, but they'll be out soon. And if you would just give us a quick email on those measures and what they kind of tell us or indicate for us, I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay. Is there anything else you're going to need from us?
Not currently.
Okay. Looking good. Okay, and now we will take a breather because we are going into topic number 3 of tonight's meeting. Do we want to take a 5-minute break, or are we ready to go straight in? Okay, we're ready to go straight in. COM 0096, Jail Operations Financial Analysis. Again, Dale Markey Crimp, Assistant to the City Administrator, bringing us the good data and analysis. Item 3 of 3.
3 of 3. I don't want to jinx it yet, but we made it to the third one. Thank you, Council President. I'm looking forward to presenting on this last topic of this evening. COM 0096, Jail Operations Financial Analysis. Dale Markey Crimp, Assistant to the City Administrator. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to provide the City Council with an analysis of the financial viability of different jail options, and to obtain City Council feedback on the administration's recommendation to continue operating the Issaquah Municipal Jail. In terms of direction needed tonight, the administration is seeking direction from the City Council on the following question and options. Should the City of Issaquah continue to operate a municipal jail? Specifically, should the city continue to operate a jail at status quo, which will be known as option 1? Should the city continue to operate the jail with key operational and safety improvements and investments, or option 2? Should the city close the jail and contract with other jails in the region to house City of Issaquah inmates, option 3? Or option 4, should the city become a SCORE member and exclusively use SCORE for jail services? Before we proceed to the analysis and a little bit of the methodology ahead of the analysis, I'd like to provide a bit of background on the Issaquah Jail. Our jail, right across the street from where we're sitting and standing this evening, opened in the year 2000. It's a 72-bed facility, mostly dormitory-style housing, with some individual holding cells. It's staffed currently by a jail commander, who's on the call this evening, 4 corrections sergeants, or 1 sergeant per shift, and 12 corrections officers, or 3 per shift, and 1 transport officer. The jail houses City of Issaquah inmates, individuals arrested by and/or serving sentences for crimes committed in Issaquah, as well as inmates from up to 16 other jurisdictions, and court commitment inmates, inmates that are sentenced for misdemeanors in other jurisdictions, but who elect to pay a premium to serve their sentence here in the Issaquah jail. This is not the first financial analysis of the jail in recent years. In 2020, staff completed a 1-year financial forecast as part of the budget process for 2021, which included recommendations to increase the guaranteed bed rate. So as you read in your materials, there are different types of bed rates. A guaranteed bed is a bed that a contract city pays for the entire month, regardless of whether or not an inmate is taking up that bed. There are guaranteed beds, there are non-guaranteed beds. A guaranteed bed has a lower rate because you are paying for it whether someone is in it or not. And a non-guaranteed bed rate is usually a higher rate because you're paying for it as you need it. As a result, in 2021, the administration implemented a rate increase for guaranteed beds. This, unfortunately, had little revenue impact at the time, as the jail census remained low due to COVID precautions, which you saw in the attachment B, which showed a deep dip in our jail population in 2020, 2021. In 2024, the administration implemented or considered the implementation of another rate increase, this time for all bed rates and for additional services, including transportation, support in virtual court, and also a booking fee. These were considered and implemented as part of the 2025-2026 budget process, and the administration is continuing to closely monitor the impacts of these increases, both on our jail census and on our jail revenues. In 2025, as part of a commitment to delivering services cost effectively, Mayor Pauly set forward an operational financial analysis of the jail as a top priority for 2025. In 2024, the City of Issaquah spent $3.8 million to operate the jail and earned about $1.65 million in revenue for a net cost of $2.6 million to operate the jail. Throughout this presentation, I will discuss future options in terms of not a single year, and not even a single biennium, but 2 biennia, so 4 years. It has cost the city approximately $7.5 million to operate the jail over the past 2 biennia, so the past 4 years. A little more background, bear with me. Even with the aforementioned guaranteed bed rate increases in 2021, the city has found that we're continuing to subsidize contract cities and court commitment inmate costs under our current model. This is why the administration raised rates for all bed types and added billing for virtual court, transportation of inmates, and added a booking fee for contract city and court commitment inmates in 2025. However, even with these, it should be noted, even with these rate increases, if we were to retroactively apply them to previous years, we would reduce that subsidy, but the market, there's a real tension with a cost that the market will bear and a cost that will fully cover those costs. The most significant direct costs.
Dale, before you go on, we've got a question on that slide, Deputy Council President.
Right, so 2023, we had a loss of $910,000, and then in 2024, $447,000, which is quite a dip. Now, could you just explain what happened? Why did we see that reduction after years of climbing numbers?
Yes, it had to do with the amount of revenues we brought in 2024. So we saw that revenue amount increase, which meant that the amount that we subsidized decreased, and this likely had to do with different fees for service that were charged to inmates. So it could be an increase in court commitment inmates. It could be that we were doing more transport, which we were actually billing for more accurately, or court support that we were billing for more accurately. There was some process improvement, the finance team supporting the jail in 2024 to be able to more accurately bill to increase our revenues. Okay. The most significant direct costs that have led to increased jail costs have been in professional and intergovernmental services. You can see in this table that focuses really on professional services and specifically on some of our largest service providers, an increase from about $580,000 to $830,000 to nearly $950,000 in just 3 years in professional services. This has been driven primarily by attorney's fees, inmate healthcare costs, and the booking of Issaquah inmates at SCORE, or the South Correctional Entity. So with that background in mind, I want to provide a little bit of information about the methodology that was used in this analysis, because it's a bit different than the analysis that was brought to council in 2020. First of all, actuals were used to determine the sort of baseline and status quo for this analysis, rather than the budget. This was done because actuals often differ from what is budgeted and provide our best understanding of the true cost of operating the jail. Also, what's notable is that the forecast here is for the upcoming 2 biennia, starting in 2027. And as addressed in a question from Council President Walsh earlier today that I'll reiterate here, in some ways we wanted to sort of bridge out because the actuals, if you use the actuals as a forecast in 25 and 26, it looks very different than our budget. And this is largely due to the fact that we said in 25 and 26 we wanted to reduce our costs and increase our revenues, and we're committed to that in this current biennium. But that doesn't necessarily accurately reflect what performance and financials have looked like over the past 5-6 years. And so I used some multipliers to get us to the next biennium, but didn't want to necessarily say, oh, I'm already expecting in 26 that we're not going to meet what we said we budgeted, so let's start in 27. Also, I wanted to provide 2 biennia, so 4 years. I think a potential shortcoming of the previous analysis was that it was too short term. It looked at 1 year, and any sort of significant policy change or operational change here is going to take more than 1 year to enact. And we'll talk through some of those proposed changes as we walk through. And then third, and this is maybe the most different part of this analysis, was that this analysis attempted to understand the true cost of insurance for operating a jail. So not just what we budget annually towards the jail's insurance costs, but what is the insurance burden for an organization operating a jail? And I'll share a bit about how we approach that. How I approached that in this analysis. So you can see on the left the way that we budget, we allocate insurance costs in our budget. We take our total insurance bill from WCIA, and we multiply that by an individual division's percentage of total worker hours. So an example could be if your total insurance bill is $2 million, and a specific division, say the police patrol, makes up 10% of the total worker hours for your entire organization, that you would allocate $200,000 in insurance costs for that division. So a more realistic example would look something like if your total insurance bill is $3.9 million and your jail workers constitute 4% of your total worker hours in your organization, they're allocated about $159,000 worth of insurance costs, and that comes out in the transfers out line of the budget. But this doesn't necessarily take into account, it's a very common way, and I would say it's like kind of the standard operating procedure for budgets. It doesn't take into account that some lines of service are inherently riskier and lead to more losses, more litigation, and more liabilities than others. Operating a jail is inherently riskier than operating a finance department, one would hope. In discussing with some actuaries, something I never thought I would do in my life, at WCIA, it was recommended that in order to get a more accurate accounting of a division's true cost of insurance, an organization might be better served by the approach on the right-hand side of your screen, which the following calculation is 70% of that division's percentage of total worker hours multiplied by your total bill, plus 30% of that division's percentage of your total losses multiplied by that total insurance bill, is going to give you maybe a more accurate accounting of how much insurance cost that particular line of service is bearing on your finances. So to use the example on the bottom left again, 70% times the 4% of worker hours times that 3.9 million, plus 30% times the percentage of losses. The jail has over recent years made up 67% of our losses, times 3.9% is going to give you $909,000, a difference of about $750,000, a little over $750,000. So this shows up as in the tables that you saw in your report tonight, and you'll see in the coming slides, that shows up, that difference shows up as additional indirect liabilities. So this is an attempt to account for the full impact of operating a jail on our city budget. Absolutely.
Yep, go for it. Councilmember Joe.
Thank you. On slide 8 of 34, you referenced the attorney's fees there, $57,000 in 23 and $62,000 in 24. Were those, I'm assuming those aren't public defender fees or prosecutor fees because that's a court function.
Yep.
Were these insurance defense fees for us?
These are not.
Okay. And so were insurance defense fees part of this calculation for the true cost of insurance?
Yes.
Okay. And could you kind of walk through how that was kind of sussed out? If you can. If you can't, don't worry about it.
It's a little bit of as nuanced as this approach seems, it's a little bit of a blunt tool, because what I did not do was I did not take our WCIA bill and look at each individual charge or line within it. Instead, I took the full bill. So I can't tell you for certain of that 909,000 in that estimate, this is how much would be payout for a loss. This is how much would be around litigation. So I don't have that specific level of information.
Okay, but a citizen looking at this presentation and analyzing your numbers would be able to feel reasonably certain that the accounting you've done does take into consideration the cost of attorney's fees for defending our cases and the advisory opinions we get or the phone calls we're making to kind of get that information?
It doesn't exactly work that way. So what you are seeing is what we are billed from WCIA each year. And so they build their rates in a completely different structure. So it's not like there are specific bills for specific calls for specific lawsuits. It is all aggregated together. It is weighed over a period of time. The monies that you saw for attorney's fees on the other slide was in part our city attorney's office working with either WCIA on some of those cases or other subsidiary issues with that. But the costs you see in the next slide from WCIA is their bill, their allocation of cost to us, which has many factors built into that. So it's you will not see anything that has lawyer bills for particular cases. That is all assumed within the rates that we pay WCIA.
Okay, I'm always concerned about the billing rate for attorneys as a standing member of the bar. But so just to summarize, we can reasonably say that we've accounted for the attorney's cost of the insurance in this calculation if we were to be asked by a citizen on the street.
We could reasonably say that this additional true cost analysis has factored in all of the bill that we get from WCIA, that it could be, I mean, you could fool around with the 70 to 30. You could say, oh, actually, I think we should do 60% worker hours and 40% claims. But what I think is important here is it's a better accounting of the insurance costs of operating this particular line of service.
Okay, thank you for that careful analysis. I appreciate it.
Of course. Okay. So this brings us to the options. There are 4 overarching options that were considered as part of this analysis. There were more options considered originally, but many were tossed to the side because they simply were too expensive or they weren't feasible in any sort of way. And so what you're going to see tonight are 4 main options with a couple of sub-options in 3 and 4 that we think are the best possible options to present moving forward. The first is the status quo. It's always important to cost out. If we do nothing different, how much will that cost us? Option number 2 is to continue to operate the jail, but with some key operational and safety improvements, specifically implementing the new rate structures, but also making some investments, as well as making some process improvements, which we'll walk through a few of those in particular. Options 3 and 4 both include closing the jail. Option 3 is closing the jail and contracting with regional jails to house Issaquah inmates. This would look simply like expanding some of the contracting out that we do currently with SCORE in King County, and would not provide too much difference in our relationship with either of those entities. Option number 4 would be a significant departure, closing the jail and becoming a SCORE member, and exclusively booking inmates with SCORE. And we'll walk through exactly what that could, a couple of iterations of what that could look like.
We've got 2 questions here, starting with Deputy Council President DeMichelle and then Councilmember Zhang.
So Dale, option number 4, can you tell me, for inmates, are those people who are 18 and older, or do we have teenagers, or, well, 18-year-olds are teenagers, sorry, but do we have like 16 or 15-year-olds there, or are they handled separately?
You know, Chief and Commander Allred are on the line. I would think that I would defer to them to answer that question.
Thank you.
SCORE is, this is the chief, thank you. I'm not sure if my video is working, but the SCORE is only for adults. They do not house juveniles.
So a follow-up to that, how would we handle juveniles in a case where we were a SCORE member?
It's no different than we do now. They would go to King County Regional Facility for juveniles. They do not go anywhere other than that in our whole county.
Okay, just making sure that's still a viable option. Councilmember Zhang.
You mentioned there were other options that were considered but were tossed because they were completely infeasible. Could you give some examples of what those were?
Sure. So we looked at booking, and we'll get into this with option number 3 in terms of like regional jail options. We looked at booking at some of the more affordable places that are further away that would actually require a transport team that's larger than our current jail staffing team, so that the cost would actually be even larger than the status quo. So anything where it exceeded the status quo, we sort of said, oh, that doesn't feel like something we want to look at. And then one other thing, and I wouldn't call this unfeasible, but something that we looked at also early in this analysis was something that we were calling the expansion of jail services. So looking to do even more potentially, and we decided that was not necessarily something we wanted to pursue as part of this current analysis. So looking at, for instance, creating a transport bus or something like that, where we would provide that service to other communities, sort of expanding our contract cities work. We decided that was outside of the scope of what we were asking, and so we didn't pursue that for this particular analysis. Okay. I promise we're going to get to the options. So as a reminder, before we jump in, these forecasts are for the next 2 biennia, or for 4 whole years, so 2027 to 2030. And they include what the analysis determined through the methodology I just shared to be a more accurate insurance cost accounting to operate the jail. So if you wondered why did jail cost around $7.5 million over the last 4 years, or the last 2 biennia, and now we're predicting somewhere between 13 to 23 for the upcoming 2 biennia, note that this is because we've factored in those indirect liability costs that have never before been factored into our actuals, because we've not done that accounting in the past. Based on the analysis, the most cost-effective near-term option for the city is to continue to operate our jail and implement the operational improvements and safety enhancements to decrease the likelihood of future jail losses and litigation. But don't take me at my word. I want to walk you through each of these options and what we considered. So I'm going to start with options 1 and 2, which both are about continuing to operate the Issaquah jail. Option number 1, which is this sort of status quo option, expects that the city would spend $27 million over the 4 years of the biennium to operate the jail. This would be due largely to continued high professional services spending, building off the trend that we've seen in the most recent 3 years, especially with healthcare costs, which have continued to rise exponentially. It would also be like, it is also due to expected high intergovernmental professional services spending, including SCORE and King County beds, and it expects additional jail losses and litigation, leading to increasing true insurance costs if we were to change nothing about the way we're conducting our service. Over the same period of time, we expect to see about $8.4 million in revenues due to the increased bed rates and other fees for contract cities and court commitment inmates that were discussed a bit earlier in the background. So the net cost that we would expect if we were to continue to operate the jail as we have in previous years, without any changes except for the increased bed rates, would be of a cost of about $18.6 million over 4 years. Seen in a different way, for those of you that like a table, the most significant increases are those additional liability costs. They continue to rise exponentially if we don't do something to interrupt what we've seen in the most recent few years. Option number 2 is we're calling safety and operational improvements. Under this option, we would expect to see expenditures of about $22 million over 4 years. There are sort of 4 main drivers that are leading to this reduction from the $27 million to the $22 million in costs over this 4-year period. The first is a process improvement around health insurance for inmates. We expect that this health insurance upon intake process improvement could save the city up to about $20,000 annually in healthcare costs. One of the big underlining drivers actually here is around staffing. That in previous years, we simply haven't had the staffing structure or numbers to be able to implement some of the best practices or process improvements that we think can lead to some of the improvements you're going to see here. So that underpins some of this. The second is staffing for monitoring and performing what I'm calling ad hoc transport when inmates are boarded at other facilities. One of the discoveries that the jail commander shared with me in our meeting was how frequently we were getting charged for ad hoc transport by other jail facilities because we simply didn't have the staff to be able to go and do that transport ourselves. And so we were being charged a premium when someone needed to be transported, and now we're able to do that ourselves, which significantly reduces the costs, those additional fees that get charged by other other jails we contract with, like SCORE or King County. Meal plan efficiencies, and I know I got a question about meal plan efficiencies and how does that reduce healthcare costs? So meal plan efficiencies that will decrease the direct food costs, which makes a good amount of sense that if we're buying a meal plan that is inclusive and safe for the majority of inmates and we're not needing to buy additional extra meals and food on top of that meal plan. So if we have a meal plan that, say, is gluten-free, and thus we're not needing to go and buy extra gluten-free meals, or it's good for folks that have diabetes, and thus we're not needing to go and buy additional heart-friendly, diabetes-friendly meals. That's going to reduce costs over time. And then the way that will also impact our healthcare costs is that unfortunately when someone is fed a meal that does not correspond with their dietary restrictions, oftentimes those folks then need healthcare to address the fact that they've consumed something that's incompatible with their digestive system. And so we expect that we could save conservatively about $50,000 in food and medical costs a year simply by changing this meal plan and making sure that we have more inclusive and better options for our inmates. And then last, but certainly not least, is grant-funded or state-funded safety enhancements, including, fingers crossed, we're still waiting on these budgets to be signed, but including a 2-year pilot for wearable safety devices for our inmates. Now, I think it's important to note that the adoption of something like the wearable safety device or a body scanner, that doesn't have a direct reduction in insurance costs. The only thing that can reduce our insurance costs are a reduction in claims, losses, and litigation. But the expectation is that the devices themselves will reduce the incidents that lead to claims, losses, and litigation. And so we would expect to see over time a reduction in those additional indirect liabilities. And you see that reflected here in a moment on the second screen. Over the same period, we expect to see that same $8.4 million in revenues for court commitment inmates and contract city inmates coming in. And so the net cost expected in option number 2 is $13.7 million over the 4 years. So showing you again with the table, you see the biggest drivers here around these lower professional services, mainly in healthcare costs. And then also additional indirect liabilities will come down over time. They'll still remain high in the near term, and I'll talk a bit about why that is in a coming slide. But they'll come down over time as claims and losses come down over time as well. Now I want to turn to options 3 and 4. Both option 3 and 4 involve closing the jail and pursuing housing inmates in a different setting. Before we look at the options, I want to share a couple of variations that you're going to see within these options. One around staffing and one around booking. There were 3 staffing models that we considered. You might be thinking, staffing models, you're closing the jail. Why are you thinking about staffing models? And it could be easy to assume that when you shut down a line of service, that the personnel costs for that service evaporate. And that is true. That is true. If you cease a line of service, the personnel lines for that line of service do go away, but you also potentially create a new line of service, which would be the case in this situation. So if we were to close the jail, we would, yes, be eliminating corrections officers from our line of service, but we would need to expand our transport service to be able to get arrested individuals to whichever jails we would contract with. We currently have only 1 transport officer because inmates are mostly housed in our jail, and transport to other jails, SCORE, King County, can happen mostly during that transport officer's primary shift. If we were to close the jail, we would need to develop a line of service for transporting individuals who are arrested to be booked, who are in jail to be transferred to their trials, and then back into custody. So we would actually be doing a lot more transportation than we're doing currently or that we could even imagine doing. In talking with our police department leadership, we considered a few different staffing models as part of this analysis. Staffing model 1, which is very clearly the most robust staffing model, for a total of 12 FTE, which is not much smaller than our current corrections staff. Staffing model number 2, which is sort of a hybrid transportation holding cell coverage model, and is considered to be the sort of middle of the road, where we'd have 8 officers, or 2 per shift, which would allow for both someone to be overseeing holding cells and also someone to be transporting on every shift. And then staffing model 3, which I'll explore with option number 4, which is a really significant reduction and potentially has its own implications on on other lines of service within the police department at 4 transportation holding cell officers, or 1 per shift. So these 3 models were considered. For option number 3, we really honed in on staffing model number 2, and I'll walk through that in just a moment. But for option number 4, we also looked into the potential of staffing model number 3. The other consideration in options 3 and 4 were around housing. Whether or not we choose to sign contracts or enter agreements with other jails with 2 different expectations in mind. One around housing all Issaquah inmates, which is a calculation based off of our average monthly bookings. We have about 50 bookings per month of Issaquah inmates in our jail that stay for around an average of 7 days. Contract costs are estimated in all Issaquah inmate bookings based on our current practices within the police department, which includes mandatory bookings, so domestic violence, DUI, and court orders, and some, but not all, non-mandatory bookings, property crimes, larceny, theft, and drug offenses. Another option, and this was explored in the 2020 analysis, and so we brought it back to explore here as well, would be housing only mandatory bookings. This calculation is based on our sort of average daily population of Issaquah inmates. It's a lower number of about 30 beds per day rather than 50 beds per day. This is lower. However, it is important to note that if we were to enter a contract for only 30 beds per day, and then we were to see an increase, we would be paying a premium because we would be then paying for non-guaranteed beds with any organization we might be booking with. Again, mandatory bookings, this would be domestic violence, DUI, court orders. And as I'll go into, there's a risk if we pursue only mandatory bookings of individuals continuing to commit crimes after they've been ticketed or cited, but not necessarily booked into a facility. So I want to walk through option 3 and 3B, and the difference you're going to see between 3 and 3B is really to do with this 50 guaranteed beds or 30 guaranteed beds. So option 3 is to close the jail and contract with other jails. We expect in this option that it will cost about $23.2 million over 4 years. It's one of the highest costs that we would expect. And that's driven largely by the cost of housing inmates under our current contracts that we have. SCORE was used for this analysis for a couple of reasons. One, that it's sort of the middle of the road when it comes to costs. And in cases where we know and have worked with SCORE, they have the ability to house the number of inmates that we would need to house. There are other municipal jails that have lower rates, jails like ours that are between 50 and 70 or 50 and 85 beds. They have traditionally been pretty choosy about who they sign contracts with. So while we do have some neighbors that have jails and potentially we could enter a contract for some certain number, we didn't want to assume a lower rate there. Also, as mentioned with Councilmember Zhang's question, there are some jails that are further away that have significantly lower rates, but the cost to get an inmate there would be exorbitant. So I think Sunnyside, is referenced in the analysis and definitely came up during our budget conversations. I think their rate is something like $63 to $65 a day, but it would require transporting people beyond Yakima potentially constantly. And so it becomes prohibitive operationally. Also, factored into these expenditures are the Issaquah transport and holding cell personnel. So we'd need to retain staff to complete intake, monitor holding cells, transport inmates to other jails. And as you see in the table in just a moment, we continue to be subject to insurance costs for 5 years after claims. I think this is outlined pretty deeply in the materials for tonight, but I want to give a high level here, which is that, again, I never thought I'd spend so much time talking to an actuary, but I did learn a lot about insurance in this project. Insurance claims against holding cells and transport are very low, if practically non-existent. However, Insurance is determined based on the previous 5 years of claims and 2 years of staffing. So you continue to carry those costs. So when you look at it and you say, what if we close the jail? Why doesn't that additional liability cost go away? Why doesn't that transfers out decrease immediately? It's because we're continuing to carry that for staffing 2 years and for losses 5 years. However, what does go to zero immediately is revenue. So you see here, revenue drops immediately to zero. We think the net cost of option 3 would be this $23.2 million over the 2 biennia. However, there we go. So you see the main reductions here, unsurprisingly, as just mentioned. Personnel, based on staffing model number 2, is lower than it is continuing to operate the jail. And jail contract costs, in this particular instance, is based on the 50 guaranteed beds at SCORE under a multiplier on our current contract costs with SCORE. Option 3B is a modification on this option. Still using staffing model number 2, which is at 8 staff members, 2 per shift, but this is booking only mandatory offenses. We'd expect the cost to be lower, naturally, with fewer guaranteed beds, at $18.3 million over 4 years. This reduced booking cost is based on that average daily population estimate, not on the monthly average booking estimate. Issaquah transport and holding cell team personnel would still be a cost here, and we would still continue to be subject to those insurance costs for 5 years after those final claims. We would again see revenues drop to zero with contract cities and court commitment inmates.
Question, go ahead.
You know, I just think it's important to be really clear about this. If someone were caught shoplifting at Target in front of 100 people and taken out of Target, and we would, under this model, we would not book them in, we would give them a ticket, is that correct?
That's my understanding. Chief, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Okay.
That's correct. Any misdemeanor crime that would happen in our city that wasn't those mandatory, that was not, for example, theft, trespass, anything along those lines would be cited and released back to the community, given a piece of paper and asked to come to court at another date.
Yep. So again, the big driver in cost reduction here is really around jail contract costs due to that mandatory bookings only, rather than booking what we believe having the number of beds that we believe would cover all our inmates. Option number 4, this one is I think the most unique, which is to close the jail and become a SCORE member. Under both of these options, you'll notice we're looking at the 50 guaranteed beds, and I'll explain why in a moment, but we're looking at 2 different staffing models here. Staffing model number 2, which is the same as explored in option 3, and staffing model number 3, which is a significant reduction in staff here. We expect in option 4A, or 4 normal, that expenditures would be about $18.5 million over 4 years. This would look as though we are exclusively booking with SCORE. So Issaquah would be a SCORE member. If you are a member of SCORE, you are only booking with SCORE, with the exception of juveniles who do not book in SCORE. Inmates cannot be booked at other facilities. They cannot be booked. We cannot book some here and some at SCORE and be a member. That's just being a contract city with SCORE. The benefits of this, there are some that are worth exploring, which is that if you become a member, you do lock in a rate and you do insure services with them. So currently, SCORE might fill up and we might not be able to book inmates with SCORE. If you become a member, you are at the top of that list for being able to book your inmates. And there's a potential to become an equity partner in SCORE in future years. Issaquah transport and holding cell team personnel would still be needed in this model. SCORE does not come to your jurisdiction and pick up the folks that you arrest. You still need to transport them. Again here, revenues would be zero, but we estimate option 4 to cost $18.5 million over 4 years. Again, you can see in the table here the main drivers in reduction here are around that SCORE contract cost. It is lower. And also, what we've seen in both option 3 and 4 is this reduced additional indirect liabilities. We did want to look at option 4B. We did want to explore what could it mean? Because if we really did become a SCORE member, while we would still need to transport our inmates to SCORE to be booked, we wouldn't necessarily need to transport them during, we wouldn't need to take them on medical trips. That would be included in our membership. Those additional fees are actually included and locked into that membership contract. And so could we look into the idea of a smaller transport team? In 4B, we estimate that it will cost about $16.2 million over 4 years, so a lower amount driven largely by a reduction in personnel. The same applies in terms of the benefits and challenges with being a SCORE member. However, I think important to note that by decreasing transport officers available, so if you only have 1 per shift instead of 2 per shift, there's a strong potential that patrol would be interrupted. Patrol officers would potentially be pulled from the streets to support transport or to support holding cells, or overtime would need to be used to backfill where needed transportation needs. So I think it's as you'll see here, yes, it does reduce the personnel costs within the jail division significantly. It potentially also has a ripple effect on the rest of the department, and on the quality of service out in the community, response times, presence of police on our streets, et cetera, things that the community has shared in the survey that they value. So that was a lot of considerations. I provided you with many things that were thought about, and many of the assumptions that went into this analysis. However, those are not the only assumptions or considerations I think should be factored in. So while these are not things that necessarily made it into the monetary bottom lines, the financial analysis of the operations of the jail, they are important considerations that the administration thought about and would like to be open and transparent about with the City Council as well. First is the capital needs of the jail. Our jail facility, as is part of our CIP process, as is part of the current conversations around public safety and civic facilities, there are updates and upgrades needed. There is already a plan underway for a number of small renovations and improvements in that space. However, while this analysis looks at 2 biennia, it does not forecast out 10 to 15 years, because in 10 to 15 years, we would need to be having a significantly different conversation about the capital needs of our jail, about a potential new jail facility. The DLR group, who's working with our facilities and administrative services team on the current civic facilities and public safety facilities project, they're working on some recommendations for us and some estimates on what costs would be. I did talk with one of the consultants on just, hey, you've built some new jails recently. How much have those cost? And the number that she quoted me was $50 million. So if you're going to build a new jail, that is the cost of the current cost of a new jail. Also, some considerations is just the unpredictability of state, federal money. We have tentatively, I feel like every time I say it, am I jinxing it, but we have tentatively secured some funding for this wearables pilot. There is additional state funding that is available for public safety services potentially in the upcoming years. Some of that money is already set aside. Some of it would require council action to unlock. And then also, really unfortunately, the federal government recently canceled their JLARC grant funding program, which really stymies a good amount of federal funding coming to local public safety entities. And then it's just this last consideration are the decisions of our regional partners. You learned tonight, and probably already knew, how expensive insurance costs for operating a jail are, both the way we budget them, but also the true underlying costs. That is not different for any other jail. It's not different for SCORE. They're also having conversations about what do their insurance premiums mean for their rates? What do their insurance premiums mean for their operating style? Do they move to only booking member cities? What does that mean for cities like us, current contract cities? That's something to think about as well in weighing maybe not our near-term immediate decision, but definitely our medium-term decision. Impacts. So there are a few different types of impacts I want to talk about that are tied to this recommendation. The first is financial. As you saw, each one of these options has a financial impact. Jail is a service. It is not purely a business. It is something that we're not expecting to make money on. And so there are costs. We believe at this moment that option 2 has the lowest overall costs, but the options 1, 3, and 4 all have costs and have values assigned to them. In terms of the policy decision, the current recommendation doesn't constitute a policy change. It's continuing to operate, but operate more efficiently, effectively, specifically when it comes to cost, specifically when it comes to reducing costs. Options 3, 3B, 4, and 4B would all require significant policy change around our approach to police services. And then impacts on the community. The current recommendation, we believe, would only present enhancements to the safety and operations of the jail and improvements actually for the inmates that we house. We think it's a service in the right direction. The other options would potentially impact the level of service that the Issaquah community receives. So as outlined, 3B could potentially lead to fewer offenders being taken into custody. And 4B, we think, could lead to interruptions in patrol service or the presence of our patrol officers in our streets. So again, the recommendation from the administration this evening is to continue to operate the jail over the near term with investments in cost-saving operational improvements and safety enhancements that would decrease the likelihood of future jail losses and litigation. But I think it's important to note that that recommendation comes with important next steps and stipulations. First of all, it is incredibly important that the administration continues in the coming months to monitor jail operating performance operating performance, the implementation of some of the safety and operational enhancements that were discussed this evening, many of which were already part of the proposed budget reductions for this current biennium, and also to monitor finances. We've talked a bit about, but haven't gone into depth about the rate increases that have been implemented for this year. But that was part of the budget discussion when they were considered for the biennial budget. We need to see that those are playing out the way we expected. That although we've increased rates, we're seeing increased revenues, not decreased contract cities and court commitment inmates as a result of those increased rates. Jail staff believes that they can implement these cost-saving measures without lowering the level of service, but we do need to make sure that this is working the way expected, and the same with those increases in rates. Secondly, we'll soon hear from the DLR group and hopefully the task force about what the future of our facilities could look like. That will certainly impact conversations about capital needs in the future, which will not exclude the jail. Also, as discussed, the current jail facility is in the process of getting some very much needed improvements, but this analysis highlighted the potential benefits of a regional approach, whether SCORE or a different regional approach, something here on the east side. And so part of the recommendations and next steps is having a really serious exploration with our neighbors here on the east side about an east side entity and whether that would make sense, whether there is appetite for that in the future. And then lastly is considering SCORE membership. You know, we explored this idea a little bit to understand the potential costs, but haven't pursued that conversation any further. And so a potential next step also is to really engage in conversation about what that could look like and over what timeline something like that would make sense. So again, the direction needed tonight is a council input on the following question. Should the city of Issaquah continue to operate a municipal jail? Specifically of the options outlined tonight, which is the best to pursue in the near term? And as a reminder, The administration is currently recommending option number 2, which is to continue to operate our jail, but with operational and safety improvements as outlined in the presentation this evening.
Big set of topics. So we are going to start with questions. Councilmember Joe, followed by Deputy Council President DiMichele.
Thank you for this excellent analysis. I appreciate the deep dive that you have made on this subject, and I feel sorry for you that you had to talk to actuaries, but I guess you got to learn a little bit something different in this job every day. Under community impacts on your slide 30 of 34, you seem to like the number 34 for slides and presentations, but under 34, slide 30 under community, you talk about fewer offenders taken into custody if we have those other options and their interruptions to patrol service. I was wondering if another impact that had been considered is, what does the court want to see? And so I'll just comment that, as many of you know, I've been on the bench as a pro tem judge, and after their first arraignment, we give them conditions of release. Commit no criminal law violations, stay away from the victim that's involved with the case. For instance, if they had robbed a store, shoplifted at a store, they have to stay away from Target. Those conditions of release will often lead to either a very low bail or no bail for an offender. But if they do violate those conditions of release, they come back here and there's a potential that I, or the judge, in this case Judge Stewart, can put them back into jail. And I'm wondering if the conversation with the jail could also talk about the ability to have that sort of Damocles hanging over them, so to speak, that if they don't do law-abiding behavior or engage in law-abiding behavior, that they could be back in jail. And if we have a jail that's right here, from my experience on the bench, I've seen that it puts the fear of the higher power in them when I talk to them about, hey, you violated a condition of release, I could put you in jail today, and then we have a conversation about what they need to do from that point forward. That can be a very effective tool to keep crime low in the city and to keep our citizens safe. So I was wondering if you would take it upon yourself to have a conversation with jail staff and the jail, and Judge Stewart about those kind of extra community benefits that we get from having a jail facility so close to us.
We definitely, not that level of specific, but we did have a discussion about the deterrent power. It didn't end up quantified in any way in here, but well made and definitely was part of the conversation.
Deputy Council President DiMichele.
I've got a couple of questions, and one of them really is following up with Councilmember Joe. So I had the same concern. In the human services arena, we know it's been very well documented that taking people out of their communities can often exacerbate the crisis that they're in. And so it's very important to try to keep people in their community if you can. Difficult in rural areas, but not so much here. We have people coming into jails who they've committed a crime, but they also might be mentally ill, or they also might be suffering from drug addiction. And again, so do we have any thoughts or data about the importance of keeping inmates in their community as they are processed through the jail experience?
You know, I did not explore that as part of this analysis. I see the chief has her hand raised, probably for the previous question, but she might also be able to weigh in a bit on that as well.
I bet she knows about this one too.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the questions. One thing is, Councilmember Joe, you are correct. As far as it being a deterrent, I can also tell you that when we talk about impacts on community that you brought up, there's a couple others which kind of tie into both these questions. Number one is just because someone chose, and if they're housed at a different court, if they did video court, for example, that would be an expense that would be added into our court, that they would need to be able to do video court more often and probably for a longer term as well on the hours and schedule for what SCORE would be wanting it for, as well as then if, let's say, someone didn't show up or we give them a citation and they're not arrested into our court and they're said to come back and come to the court on the court date, and then they don't. That incurs more warrants, which means we can't always even arrest on the warrants, because based on the amount of bail, it doesn't justify us being able, or taking someone off the street for basically 2 to 4 hours, 1 hour each direction, to take them to SCORE if there happens to be someone that we didn't have a transport, for example, 24 hours a day. And the other piece to that is, that means it's an officer off the street, and there are laws. It was presented that there are some holding cells that we could have, but there are certain laws on how long you can keep someone in a holding cell. So happen if they're having to be arrested at 6:30 at night, it may not even be that we're allowed to hold them in a holding cell for up to that 12 hours or 14, to where someone comes up on day shift to be able to transport them the next day. So we just advise on the warrant, and then they're not arrested. So your question about deterrent, even for the courts, but even for patrol, is another great one. To Barbara DeMichelle's question regarding the people and impacts in our community, right now we have that behavioral health division that really does a ton of outreach between the officers, and they come to our facility quite often for our specific community members that are from our area that say that they don't have a primary resident and are basically from our area. We and they, the behavioral health division, come and talk to them and give them resources and help them out, and help so many different people that would not be as much an option anymore. They would have to catch them out in the community, not actually at the facilities anymore. So again, either incurring more costs for our behavioral health to go down to SCORE, or for them not even to be able to reach them because they're not in our establishment. So those are other pieces. And a couple of the other impacts is officer retention, because right now patrol would be greatly affected if right now they're not having to drive and be transport officers for a lot of their profession or job. They enjoy being able also, when they go, instead of giving someone a piece of paper, and it's a deterrent for criminals to be out of our city because they know we have a jail. Word spreads quickly that I don't want to go to jail even if I commit a minor crime, whereas in Issaquah they know that is something that will happen if they're made contact with officers. So all of those are factors that our community that really do impact that option for not only the resources, but the ability and retention of officers that are just even patrol, for not having that ability to enforce the laws and binding them, which a lot of other cities who don't have their own jail already are dealing with, and that retention can be problematic.
Thank you, Chief Schwan, and I think in that answer, she answered my second question as well. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, I was waiting. I had a whole list, but I knew Councilmember Hall. Councilmember Hall.
Thanks. A couple. Chief Schwan, you had mentioned video court. Just to confirm, is that common for other jails to offer remote court options? So that's something that could still happen?
Yes, we have remote or video court now.
Right.
It is something that we do charge for, and so do the other entities.
Okay.
So for example, when you went to SCORE, if that would be part of your contract. And it also should be noted that there are some agencies who did used to contract with SCORE and was a member and have gone away from that. And actually Federal Way, who actually books with us, happens to be one of them that decided and made a decision to not work with SCORE and be a member anymore. And it was more cost effective by the tune of almost $5 million by having some other options. So those are some other factors that do come into play in some of these decisions that are being made, but for sure.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. It looks like someone's hand's
Yeah, I
up,
was
so
going
I'll
to say
defer.
Commander Allred.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? It's the first time I'm using the speaker.
Yeah, we can. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to, as well as add to that, what Chief is saying. Occasionally, SCORE does offer the video court. However, it's a premium price that we pay on top of what we're already paying. The other thing is that sometimes we have to book into other facilities like King County. King County doesn't, which then would go back to what Councilmember Joe was saying about being able to see these inmates. Now what would happen is we'd have to go pick that inmate up at King County. We'd have to bring him back to the city of Issaquah, be seen on, maybe it's a first time being seen in front of the judge, we take them back, and then we'd have to, at a later date, go get them again, bring them back for court. So it's this back and forth process, that could potentially be a heavy load and impact on the department itself.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the response to that. And Chief Schwan had also mentioned about a jurisdiction too that was with SCORE and moved away. I would like to learn more about kind of case studies of maybe jurisdictions that have moved away from SCORE and why. I think that could be helpful information for us. I guess my last thought, right? Last thought. Oh no, I have two more thoughts. Have we thought more about what would so let's say we move forward with option 2 with the administration recommendation. We're waiting to see kind of what happens with the new rate structure. We're doing new safety enhancements, some new improvements. What have we thought about what would happen if more jurisdictions move to the non-guaranteed bed rate and how that might impact our long-term thinking?
Yeah, that went into our original and actually analysis when we thought about the rate change, and I'm sure Commander Allred will have some thoughts as well. But when we made the rate change, we first and foremost looked at how much does it cost for an inmate to be booked in our jail for a day, and that was a very high number, and one that the market could not sustain. So it was above $250 per night for just the average inmate. That was up from what we had been previously charging, I think about $115. Looking at the market, we determined we could probably raise our guaranteed bed rate to $150, our non-guaranteed bed rate a bit higher than that, and then our court commitment bed rate, specifically, that these are folks who are choosing to come here, that could probably be even higher. And that one hadn't been considered previously to change, which it was just a curiosity of mine. And we kind of costed out an assumption that we bet you that a few jurisdictions will reduce their guaranteed bed rate because they'll see this cost increase. And then we'll need to see, does that actually also lead to decreased bookings from that particular jurisdiction? So an example might be a city that has previously had 3 guaranteed beds with us. Maybe they lower that to 2 beds. Do we see a corresponding change in actually how many bookings they do and how many nights on average they've got inmates in our jail? And Commander Allred can speak a little bit more, but the last time that he and I checked in, I'm talking about a particular jurisdiction, they had lowered their guaranteed beds from 3 to 2, but they were still booking with us just as frequently, and unfortunately for them now paying a slightly higher rate because they were now paying for non-guaranteed beds. So I think we just won't, it's 4-5 months into the year. My instinct is we're just not going to know until the end of the year if what we've forecasted for this year is actually playing out the way we expected, but know that we're keeping a really close eye on that to make sure that we have an understanding if it does. No, Commander, if you would add anything to that.
I mean, you basically said it there, Dale. I appreciate it, but I will add that yes, there are some cities that went to 0 guaranteed beds. However, watching it the last couple months, that number of bookings has stayed the same. So just like Dale said, unfortunately, they're paying a higher price because they're still booking into our facility, and they just chose to, thinking that maybe they wouldn't. I don't know the reason behind it, but they are paying a higher price now because of that. Even we gained a city. We lost some, like the city of Bothell. City of Bothell hadn't booked maybe one booking in the last couple years. We lost them. However, we gained one, like the city of Buckley. And Buckley, when they came to us, just wanted no guaranteed beds. And however, the last couple of months, they've been booking 1 or 2 to 3 inmates, and we've been housing them for them, and they're paying that premium price again. So like Dale said, it really hasn't impacted the amount of bookings, and they're just paying a higher premium for it. than we have in the past.
Yeah, I in fact went and looked at our munis actuals prior to this meeting because I was curious to see where we were at through April compared to where in the budget we had forecast we were going to be with revenues, and we're tracking right on target. So I think that's encouraging that we've made a change that I think seemed a little scary, honestly, to us. It felt a little bit like we were taking a risk, but the market's bearing it, and then the question becomes in the future if the market would bear more.
Okay, thank you. That is super interesting how this is playing out already just in a few months, and I will message received, wait and see. We still have a lot more to learn this year. So, is it okay if I ask my final question? My final question is around, I don't even know how to ask this. The capital needs, like this is a big concern to me. Like this seems to be like kind of a keystone decision in terms of like what really is going to be the long-term path that we choose. It's something the task force is being told kind of not to consider at the moment, and that there's kind of other work around what are the jail capital needs going on in the background. Is our sense that, I mean, I guess I'm seeing kind of two paths here. If it's like capital improvements that can happen over a long period of time, perhaps that's something we can budget for. But if it's like upfront major improvements, to me that seems like that would almost like make our decision for us in terms of can we even afford to continue to operate a jail? Am I thinking about that right, or can you share any more about how we're thinking about capital needs?
I think there are sort of near-term capital needs in terms of some of these renovations and improvements that have been identified as sort of primary needs within the jail right now. I think the task force, did a tour of the jail. And you can see walking in there, there's some real needs, especially for our staff and both their security and safety, and also just like the ergonomic experience, I would say, in that space is not super, and leaves a lot to be desired. And those sorts of improvements and renovations, those are already sort of on the facilities team's purview. They are thinking about them. They are showing up in the CIP. Those are sort of the small near term. If we're thinking about operating a jail over the next 7 years, like those are the doable renovations that feel very much within what we've already budgeted for, taking bites of as we go. I think there's a bigger question, and I've asked DLR to weigh in on this, is sort of what is the long-term safety and viability of our jail? This is a jail that's now 25 years old. At some point, it will need to be modernized. We can't continue to operate that same jail for the next 25 years. We can safely operate it for sure for the next 7 to 10, but after that, that would be a bigger conversation about a new facility potentially.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, looks like another hand.
Chief Schwan, do you have a comment there?
Well, I was just going to ask Dale, correct me if I'm wrong, also one of the CIPs that they were talking about happens to be the HVAC, which also happens to be what's needed for the whole building. So some of that is also incurred or already thought about in one of the big pieces of the CIP that are needed right away, correct?
Chief is absolutely correct, yeah.
Okay, looking around, any other questions? Okay, I'll go through my slew. So I'm having trouble evaluating option 2 because it seems like it relies pretty heavily on cost savings based on safety improvements and wearable technology. But in other areas, we've kind of highlighted the fact that the inmates we're receiving lately have had higher medical needs and risks. So how can we be saying that the inmates are more difficult and also believing that we can make those changes that will reduce our risks and our insurance costs?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, The big difference between 1 and 2, it doesn't assume, and actually 3 and 4, doesn't assume anything different about our population. It assumes differences in our operating costs. I think the biggest drivers of reductions in option 2 are not actually purely the sort of wearables and safety interventions. It's actually the operating improvements. It's the health insurance at intake. It is the reducing our current additional fees incurred from our professional services by actually going and, as Commander Allred was saying, was like intercepting these ad hoc transports that we're then being charged a premium for. And it's that third piece around our food costs and then the resultant medical needs by serving someone food that they then need to go to the hospital to receive treatment for. So those are, I think, actually the biggest drivers of immediate cost reduction. That wearables and the sort of safety interventions, those we don't start to see those reductions until I think the second or third year of the projection, because we'd expect to get those wearables in the second half of this year, and hopefully then start to see those reductions. But we're still going to carry those high insurance costs from the last few years into the beginning of this. So it's, unfortunately, those are not as immediate of a reducer in cost. It's some of the operational improvements that we've talked about that are going to be the more immediate driver of cost reduction.
Okay, I may need to go over that 1 or 2 more times. For staffing models of options 3 and 4, did we consider a version where patrol is the additional transport, but we're adding patrol officers, which would increase our capacity of patrol officers and thus not reduce the number of patrol officers we have on hand?
You know, no. The short answer is not really. No, I think the back of the napkin is that a patrol officer is actually more expensive than a transport officer.
Yes,
and I
and more
think
valuable.
More valuable, but then I also think anecdotally, and I think Chief could probably weigh in on this as well, a patrol officer probably wants to be doing something different than a transport officer. And so I think recruiting for that kind of hybrid position might be kind of difficult. And of course, then negotiating and bargaining for a different type of role might be a challenge as well. So I think those are some of the things that led us to instead really pursue modeling out a transportation team rather than beefing up patrol and then having potentially retention challenges with people doing work they didn't necessarily want to do.
Okay. Another thing I'm trying to evaluate and understand is, if we look at the long-term history of our jail operations, we didn't have any losses prior to 2023.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to determine, you've noted that the insurance costs will reset 5 years after a loss. Are we doing an analysis in a period of time where our costs are abnormally high? Or is there a way to evaluate this as if those experiences didn't happen? Would we be looking at this differently? And are we making a long-term decision based on short-term cost increases?
It's almost like you joined me on my many dog walks over the last 4 months as I thought about this. And part of absolutely, the loss, those 2 losses in 2023 significantly inflated insurance costs. And so rather than assuming another 2 losses every couple of years, what instead, for this analysis, for the status quo option, assumed 1 loss at some point in the next 2 biennia. And so tried to sort of split the difference there by saying, we might be looking at a sliver that's not very accurate. Certainly, if we were to look over 25 years and say 2 over 25, then we're talking about a very small fraction. But this goes back to your earlier question around just when we look at the state, at losses happening in other jails around the state. When we look nationally, we we can't go back. We can't do the 2 and 25. We have to say something is really changing about the state of the world. And so making that decision to say, okay, let's assume 1 loss in the next 2 biennia felt like a reasonable way to split that difference.
Okay, thanks for that. And then did we consider eliminating our contracts and keeping the jail running by only housing Issaquah residents as inmates?
We did.
And was that one of those non-viable, it would be more expensive?
It was very expensive.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it was very expensive because unfortunately, we wouldn't necessarily see a significant enough reduction in beds filled to then lead to lower personnel costs.
Yep.
And we would retain the risk still of the losses. And so it's actually really interesting. Some of our neighboring cities that operate municipal jails have historically not had contract city inmates. They've only housed their own inmates. And that's actually really changed in the last 3 or 4 years. I was looking for an example of a city that just did that. And every city that I called that someone had said, oh, I think so-and-so only books their own inmates, I would email them and they say, oh, actually, we just took on 4 contract cities for the first time. And so it's not penciling out for anyone to do that.
Okay. Okay, those are my questions. Anybody else? Councilmember Ray?
And I really wasn't going to have a question until what you just said, which is, how do our rates compare to these other surrounding cities that are now getting into the contracting business?
The one main comparison, I would say, in terms of our neighbors, we currently charge a little bit more. So Kirkland is the city that I think of. I think their guaranteed bed rate is $134. I have to pull up the document from the budget discussion this past fall. Oh, 131. Okay, Council President Walsh has the number on it, but it's around 130, lower than ours. I am not, I'm assuming a follow-up question of like, are we worried that other cities are going to leave us and go to them? I don't foresee that as a thing that we're going to see happen. And I would be surprised if their rates don't come up here shortly.
Okay, Commander Allred, looks like comment?
Yeah, I would just add to that too, that we are offering services that I don't think any other, if Dale's made other phone calls, but are offering, like the video court in our own jail. And so we're offering an additional fee to kind of host those courts for those surrounding agencies. And we're looking at seeing those, Dale's touched on a little bit of some of that revenue coming in, but it's slowly increasing, and it's become a very convenient viable option for these agencies, where they don't have to have a transport officer come out or a patrol officer come out to Issaquah and then pick up their inmate and take them to court, where we just house it for them on video court. And so it's we just haven't had the time frame to kind of collect a bunch of data for that, but it is increasing weekly. So, and that's, our transport officer kind of tracks that now. And so it is something that we offer that others don't. And so I think that's why a lot of them will still continue to kind of book with us.
Okay, great feedback. I am going to turn it over and check in on any public comments at this time. So if anybody is online, on the phone, *3. If you're on a computer or smartphone, use the raise hand icon or send the host a chat message. And I will look at our one sole member here, see if anybody wants to make public comments. Not seeing any online. Okay, fantastic. So we've asked questions. We've seen a lovely presentation. Who wants to start us out with feedback? Oh, it's a race. So Deputy Council President DeMichelle, we'll just go down the line at this point.
Well, first of all, Dale, it's wonderful the way you show your work. You take us through it step by step and make it really understandable. And I'd so much appreciate the work you did on this very complex project, and the amount of data that you've provided to us, and the relevance of the data to our decision is really outstanding. So thank you so much. I am in support of option number 2 as recommended by the administration. And just looking through, I think one of the things that we need to think about is if we do decide to close the jail, maybe not now, but later or whenever, it's going to be an irrevocable decision. We will close it and we will never open up another jail exactly like that because it's so expensive to get into this business. So I think we need to be really thoughtful and careful about this decision. Right now, financially, it makes the most sense to continue to operate the jail and look for those efficiencies as you've outlined. But this is a financial decision. To me, it's also a matter of, as a community, to make sure that our values are reflected in our jail and court system. And in that regard, we are well aware that Issaquah offers a quality, I hate to say this, a quality jail experience, but we do. We offer a lot of supports to the inmates that are there, and that's reflected in the number of people who are willing to pay to come and serve their time here, and through a lot of other anecdotes that we hear about all the time. So as a resident of Issaquah, I like the fact that our tax dollars that have to go to a criminal and justice system are being used wisely and humanely, and that's really important to me. And so it might be a little bit hard to explain to people in the community the amount of money we're spending on our jail system, but I think at this point in time, it could change if costs become exceedingly higher. But right now, at this moment, I will support option number 2. I do think, and other people have commented on this, that the fentanyl crisis has changed the nature of what we're facing in the jails, and whatever we can do, and I don't have any options to offer tonight, but whatever we can do to address that, and I'm sure Chief Schwan and others are doing that, it really has changed the character of the threats that are there in operating a jail. So thank you again for everything you've done. Thanks.
Going down the line? This is really easy, quite honestly. I mean, option 2, not only is it the low-cost option, but it also maintains the same level of service. So nothing else really compared. So that part's easy. I have 2 caveats. One is I still think we need to do a lot more work around what we charge for a bed. I don't think we're at the right number. The subsidy is still way too high in my estimation. I think that the demand for our services is very inelastic, where a small increase in price or an increase in price will have a very small impact on demand. And that was why I asked the question about Kirkland, because I don't think that's the case. And then Commander Allred gave me the talking point that I was looking for, which was we're going through this machinations of looking at other options, and we keep coming back to the fact that there's a service here that is of high value, and our partner cities are looking at this and saying, we sure don't want to pay that, but it's better than the options. So I think we are being timid about rate increases, quite honestly, and maybe we need to be a little more aggressive so that we can get a fair recovery metric in place, because when I look at those numbers where over half the population in the jail is a contract population, it just doesn't make sense to me that we're subsidizing these other communities. And I think it's a great service we have, and I think it's great for our community to have it, but I don't want to pay for our contract cities. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is around capital recovery and the long term. I think when we're going to hit a point, maybe it's 15 years from now, maybe it's 20 years from now, when the jail is going to need to be rebuilt. But that's, I think, a decision for 20 years from now. And right now, we need to make sure that we are doing factoring in the cost of maintenance and enhancements to the jail, and that we factor those into the cost and also into the rates. So, thanks. And fun presentation, really interesting.
Well, I agree with a lot of what's been said, so I won't share everything I was going to say, also because the hour is late, but I do just want to say, like, I don't know how you did all of this and all the work you did on the community survey and the performance measures and the meaningful progress you've made in the loneliness and social isolation epidemic and everything that you do behind the scenes that we don't see. Like, you truly are like one of the most remarkable local government professionals I've ever known. Like, crazy. Like, anyways, I'll stop gushing. But also, like, the best, like, crash course on jail operations I've ever received on the council, too. Like, super helpful in the most detailed characterization of how we're subsidizing jail costs to others that I have, or at least I certainly hadn't appreciated how large that gap was until I read your memo. So, anyways, thank you for that. I agree also with the recommendation to follow option 2, monitor, see if rates help or hurt, right? Add improvements and then kind of reevaluate start of 2026 or sometime early 2026 is the idea there. I also agree with Councilmember Ray that we should push and find out where that desired rate should sit. Well, I mean, we'll learn more this year, like you said, in terms of kind of how our rate increase impacts contract cities and others. But yeah, I would support finding out where that sits. And also, I'm very interested in this idea in terms of next steps of like working with our neighboring cities and in the region. Like, is there some sort of regional approach, whether it's a facility or whether it's just additional supports in kind of the mental and behavioral health space and healthcare and cheaper than the kind of professional and intergovernmental supports that we get right now. Like, that sounds really exciting, and we should be leading and pushing in that space for sure. I think I agree with what you said too about the capital needs. Like, that is a future decision. It's just something that kind of haunts me. It seems like a large dollar item, and if it's going to make our decision in the future inevitable, like, there's always a question in the back of my head of like, well, what are we doing? Why aren't we just making the jump if we know that's where we're headed? But I think you've got the right analysis for right now in terms of let's stick with the value we know that we provide for the community and then have that conversation when we get there. And the only other thing I wanted to add to, there's a policy question around whether or not to book only mandatory. I think you're hearing, at least so far, some consensus around continuing to book both mandatory and non-mandatory offenses. I don't think that moving away from booking non-mandatory offenses would be an acceptable solution in our community. I mean, we hear this kind of thing all the time. Other communities let people go. How could they? Like, it's something I hear all the time from people, right? So, and that's a real policy tool to discourage the organized retail theft, which was such a huge problem a few years ago. And then also a good point, Chief Swan, that you brought up about like officer retention too. Like, they don't want to be driving all the way over there and back. So ruling out options 3B and 4B makes sense to me. Thanks.
Thank you again for this great presentation. I would be supportive of continuing to explore option number 2. I would ask that we continue to talk to the court about their value to the system that they see for the jail being here. Also, explore the regional partnership for a jail. Back in the old days, 20 years ago in 2004, when I was on the Regional Law, Safety, and Justice Committee, we were talking about sharing regional assets. And we talked and talked and talked, and after about 2 years, we decided the one asset that we would share would be the King County helicopter, and people could call on them and get some help. We couldn't agree on anything else. A jail is part of the conversation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we should explore it, but be reasonable and grounded in the fact that it will be a hard conversation to have going forward. Just one suggestion for a rate increase, perhaps we explore doing a rate increase based on the CPI, so that it is a rate that's not ours that we're setting, but cities will see it as something that's fair and something that's transparent along the way. So I'll just throw that out there as a consideration for the future. We're going to run into capital challenges in all different areas, and the jail is no different. I know that the administration and all the staff are thinking about that. We do need to continue to devote attention to that and see if there are opportunities for us to capitalize on an opportunity that might be out there in the future. So good work tonight. Continue to explore option 2. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that everyone else said. You know, it's a pretty easy decision when the lowest cost option is also one that keeps the level of service that we're used to. I definitely echo Councilmember Ray in saying, you know, I support increasing the rates. I'd be interested to see, like, what the rates, you know, is there a model of a rate that would actually reduce the subsidy to 0 and what that would be? And then, you know, maybe we don't jump to that level next year, but we can know what that number would actually be so that we can see, you know, how big the gap is. I also, you know, really appreciate that in Issaquah, you know, we have these human services supports in our facilities. And I'd actually be curious to see if we have any data on if that affects, you know, recidivism rates and how that compares to other jails in our region, to see if there's, you know, some data on how those, you know, human services supports help our community. But other than that, you know, I want to echo what Councilmember Hall said. I'm extremely impressed that, like, I mean, it's been like 3.5 hours of you presenting all the amazing work you've done. So thank you for all your work.
Okay, I will end it off. You know, when I was evaluating this, as much as it's a budget decision, I think it also comes back to our community values. And so I was starting to think, you know, especially on a night when we're seeing community survey results, the community values that I was reflecting as I was evaluating this was, first, keep our police officers on the streets. So we don't want an option that would require officers to have to be transporting or going long distances to jails. The second is we want to make sure we have control of our ability to enforce our laws and arrest as needed, not just mandatory. All that being said, I don't think most Issaquah residents know we have a jail, nor have all that much care about it. And so one of their biggest things is going to be keep our costs low. And part of that is not subsidizing other cities or court commitments and reducing our risk of cost increases. So as we go through all of that, I think I'm leaning toward option 2. The only thing that I'm a little bit, you know, presents a potential concern or opportunity is both the future capital facility needs, and yes, I agree that is probably mid to long term, but we are evaluating what we do with our current city hall space. And we are considering going out to residents and saying, look, we have this need. Would it make sense for us to evaluate a potential cost savings of eliminating the jail and being able to utilize that space for police and keep the top level for City Hall? I think that is enough of a relationship to the current conversations we're having about our City Hall facility needs and administrative and public safety needs that we need to strongly consider. You know, if, say, City Hall Northwest was right next to the other building, I would have had a very difficult time letting that go, considering we have these space needs. And so I just bring that up because we strongly need to understand what our needs are before going out to the public. And if we could do so at the same time as doing this other adjustments that we're going to make on the City Hall building for the safety improvements there for earthquakes and such, I think that would be important. And then I will agree with several of the other council members. I don't think we've gone far enough to increase our jail rates to both our contract cities and especially our court commitments. If somebody's choosing to be here, they need to pay the full fare. And And I think you've given the good example of Federal Way. If they experience $5 million of cost savings from contracting with us rather than SCORE, that's potentially costs that we are incurring on their behalf. And if we are able to understand what the needs are of these jurisdictions, especially if you indicate, virtual court gives them cost savings and quality improvements where they don't have to transport someone back and forth, that could be a significant reason why somebody chooses to work with us on that. And so I just make sure that we're looking at including their cost savings as potential costs that we charge in order to make up the difference in some of those rates. Okay, I'm going to reflect back to council members any other feedback we want to provide at this time. Okay, Dale, the end of a very long meeting here on this. And might I add, the end of your time here for a little while.
For a little bit.
Yeah, no, just a little while. All of that. Do you have what you need, City Administrator Bob Quitz? Anything else?
Yes, thank you for all of the considerations tonight, not only for the jail item, but also the survey and the performance measures. As the council president indicated, this is the last you're going to see of Dale for a little while. She's going on maternity leave tomorrow. And we had hoped and planned for 6 months that this was a red circle day on the calendar to give her the maximum amount of time to work on these projects, but also to make sure that we got this done before her departure. So, Dale, thank you for your excellent work, especially the jail. I mean, the analysis is really going to be a linchpin, I think, for the council's discussions in July as we look at any changes mid-biennium and also then lays groundwork for future budgets. So, Dale, thank you and best wishes. We'll see you in October.
Okay, looking at that, we have good of the order. Anyone have anything to bring up? Okay, then I'm going to mark us adjourned at 9:56 p.m. Thank you, everyone.